Semirag stopped listening. Any other time, there would have been a spreading glow of pleasure, but the patient's defiance had not been crushed yet. The purest exhilaration came from shaving away defiance and dignity in minute slices, watching the patient finally realize that they were going and struggle vainly to cling to what remained. No time for that now. Carefully, she once more set the web on the pain centers of Cabriana's brain and knotted it. Normally, she liked to be in personal control, but some haste was necessary. Triggering the net, she channeled to extinguish the lights and left, closing the door behind her. Darkness would work its part too, alone in the dark with the pain. Despite herself, Semirag made a vexed sound. There was no finesse in this. She did not like having to hurry, and to be called away from her charge. The girl was willful and obdurate, the circumstances difficult. The corridor came close to matching the chamber for bleakness, a broad, shadowy shaft through stone, with crossing passageways that she had no desire to explore, nearly lost in the murk. Only two other doors were in sight, one leading to her present quarters. They were comfortable enough rooms if she had to be here, but she made no move toward them. Shaidar Haran stood in front of that door, black-clad and wreathed in dimness like smoke, so still that it was almost a shock when it spoke, a sound of bone dust being ground. What have you learned? The summons to Shail Ghul had resulted in a warning from the Great Lord. When you obey Shaidar Haran, you obey me. When you disobey Shaidar Haran. However much the warning nettled, there had been no need for more. Her name, Cabriana Mekandis. I could hardly learn more so quickly. It flowed across the hallway in that eye-wrenching way, ebon cloak hanging in denial of motion. One moment it was a statue 10 paces away, the next it loomed over her, so she had the choice of backing away or craning her neck to look up at that dead-white, eyeless face. Backing away was out of the question. You will drain her completely, Semirag. You will squeeze her dry without delay and tell me every scrap that you learn. I promised the Great Lord that I would, she told it coldly. Bloodless lips twisted in a smile. That was its only reply. Turning sharply, it strode away through patches of shadow and abruptly was gone. Semirag wished she knew how Myrdral did that. It had nothing to do with the power, but on the edges of shadow, where light was becoming dark, a Myrdral could suddenly be elsewhere, in another shadow far away. Long ago, Aginor had tested over 100 of them to destruction in a vain effort to learn how it was done. The Myrdral themselves did not know. She herself had proved that. Abruptly, she realized that her hands were pressed hard against her stomach, which seemed a ball of ice. It had been many years since she had felt fear anywhere except facing the Great Lord in the pit of doom. The frozen lump began to melt as she moved to the other prison door. Later she would analyze the emotion dispassionately. Shaidar Haran might be different from any other Myrdral she'd ever seen, but it was still a Myrdral. Her second patient, hanging like in midair, was a blocky, square-faced man in a green coat and breeches suitable for fading into a forest. A full half of the glow bulbs here shimmered on the edge of failure. That any had survived so long was a miracle, but Cabriana's warder was unimportant, really. What was needed, for whatever purpose, rested in the Aes Sedai's mind. Yet the Myrdral apparently had been told to capture an Aes Sedai, and in their minds, for some reason, Aes Sedai and warders seemed inseparable. As well they had, though. She had not before had an opportunity to break one of these storied fighters. His dark eyes tried to bore holes through her head as she removed his clothing and boots, and destroyed them as she had Cabriana's. He was hairy, a mass of large, hard muscles and scars. He never flinched. He said nothing. His defiance was different from the woman's. Hers was bold, flung in your face. His, a quiet refusal to bend. He might be harder to crack than his mistress. Normally, he would have been much the more interesting. Pausing, Semirag studied him. There was something, a tightness around the mouth and eyes. as if he already fought pain. Of course, that peculiar bond between Aes Sedai and Warder. Strange that these primitives should have come up with something that none of the Chosen understood, yet it was so. From the little she knew, this fellow quite possibly felt at least some of what the other patient was undergoing. Another time, that would present interesting possibilities. Now it only meant that he thought he knew what he was facing. "Your owner does not take very good care of you," she said. "If she was more than a savage, there would be no need for you to be marred with all those scars." His expression changed only slightly, to a tinge of contempt. "So." This time she set the net on the pleasure centers and began the slowly increasing stimulation. He was intelligent. He frowned, shook his head, then his eyes narrowed, fixed on her like chips of dark ice. He knew he should not be feeling that rising bliss, and though he could not see her net, he knew it had to be her work, so he set himself to fight it. Semirog almost smiled. No doubt he thought pleasure easier to fight than pain. On rare occasions she had broken patience with no more than this. It gave her little enjoyment, and afterward they could not think coherently, simply wanting more of the ecstasy that bloomed in their heads. But it was quick, and they would do absolutely anything for more. That lack of coherence was why she had not used it on the other patient. She needed answers there. This fellow would learn the difference soon enough. Difference. She put a finger to her lips in thought. Why was Shaidar Haran different from every other Myrddraal? She did not like discovering an oddity just when everything seemed to be going in their favor, and a Myrddraal set above the Chosen, even occasionally, was more than a mere oddity. Althor was blinded, his attention all on Samael, and Graendal was letting Samael know enough to keep him from ruining everything with his pride. Of course, Graendal and Samael were certainly scheming for advantage, together or separately. Samael was a hot Sofar with warped steering planes, and Graendal not much easier to predict. They had never learned that power came only from the Great Lord, handed out as he chose for his own reasons, at his whims. She could think that in the safety of her head. More troubling were the Chosen who had vanished. Demon Dread insisted they must be dead, but she and Messana were not so sure. Lanfear. If there was any justice, time would give her Lanfear. The woman was always there when least expected, always behaving as if she had the right to dabble her fingers in others' plans, always flitting to safety if her dabbling brought ruin. Gideon. She skulked out of sight, but she had never gone so long before without making herself known, just to remind the rest of them that she, too, was chosen. Asmodean. A traitor, and so doomed, but he really had vanished, and Shaidar Haran's existence and her own orders here combined to remind her that the Great Lord worked in his own ways toward his own goals. The Chosen were no more than pieces on the board. They might be counselors and spires, but they were still pieces. If the Great Lord moved her here secretly, might he not be moving Moghedien or Lanfear or even Asmodean? Might Shaidar Haran not be sent to deliver covert commands to Graendal or Samael, or for that matter to Demon Dread or Messana? Their uneasy alliance, if it could be called by so strong a name, had lasted a long time, but neither would tell her if they received secret orders from the Great Lord, any more than she would ever let them learn of the orders that had brought her here, or those that had had her send Myrddraal and Trollocs to the Stone of Tyr to battle those sent by Samael. If the Great Lord meant to make Althor nameless, she herself would kneel to him and wait for a slip to deliver him into her hands. Immortality meant infinite time to wait. There would always be other patients to amuse her in the meantime. What troubled her was Shaidar Haran. She had never been more than an indifferent Charon player, but Shaidar Haran was a new piece on the board, one of unknown strength and purpose, and one daring way to capture your opponent's high counselor and turn it to your side was to sacrifice your spires in a false attack. She would kneel, if need be, for as long as need be, but she would not be sacrificed. An odd feel to the net pulled her out of her thoughts. She took one look at the patient and clicked her tongue in exasperation. His head hung to one side, chin dark with blood where he had chewed his tongue, eyes staring and already filmed over. Inattention, and she had let the stimulation grow too fast, too far. With an irritation that never touched her face, she stopped channeling. There was no point trying to stimulate the brain of a corpse. A sudden thought occurred to her. If the warder could feel what the Aes Sedai felt, was the reverse true? Eyeing the scars that decorated the man's body, she was sure it was impossible. Even these simple fools would have altered the bond if it meant sharing the feel of that. Still, she abandoned the cadaver and stepped across the corridor with some haste. Screams heard before she opened the iron-bound door onto darkness brought a deep breath of relief. Killing the woman before draining her of everything she knew would probably have meant remaining here until another Aes Sedai was captured, at the least. There were barely intelligible words among the throat-shredding howls, words that seemed to have all the force of the patient's soul behind them. Please! Oh, light! Please! Semirag smiled faintly. There was a little fun in this after all. Chapter 7. A Matter of Thought. Seated on her mattress, Elaine finished the 100 strokes with her left hand, then put the hairbrush away in her small leather traveling case and pushed it back under the narrow bed. A dull ache rested behind her eyes from a day spent channeling, making ter'angreal. Too often trying to make ter'angreal. Nynaeve, balanced atop their loose-jointed stool, had long since completed brushing her waist-length hair and was nearly done replaiting her braid loosely for sleep. Sweat made her face glisten. Even with the one window open, the small room was stifling. The moon hung fat in a star-filled black sky. Their stub of candle provided a fitful glow. Candles and oil lamp were in short supply in Salidar. No one got more than a scrap of light at night unless they had to work with pen and ink. The room truly was cramped, with little space to move around the two short beds. Most of what they owned was packed away in a pair of battered brass-bound chests. Accepted's dresses and cloaks they certainly had no need of now hung from pegs in the walls, where ragged holes in the crazed yellowing plaster showed the lathing beneath. A tiny table with a tilt was shoved between the beds, and a rickety washstand in the corner held a white pitcher and basin with an amazing number of chips between them. Even Accepted, who had their heads patted at every turn, were not indulged. A handful of bedraggled blue and white wildflowers, fooled by the weather into blooming late and not very well, stuck out of a yellow vase with a broken neck between a pair of brown pottery cups on the table. The only other spot of color was a green-striped song sparrow in a wicker cage. Elaine was nursing it for a broken wing. She had tried her small skill with healing on another bird, but songbirds at least were too small to survive the shock. No complaining, she told herself firmly. Aes Sedai lived a little better, novices and servants a little worse, and Gareth Bryn's soldiers slept on the ground most often. What can't be changed must be endured. Linny used to say that all the time. Well, Salidar held small enough comfort, and no luxury, and no coolness either. Pulling her shift away from her body, she blew down her front. We want to be there ahead of them, Nynaeve. You know how they go on if they have to wait. Not a breath of breeze stirred, and the parched air seemed to pull perspiration from every pore. There must be something that could be done about the weather. Of course, if there was, Seafolk wind-finders would probably already have done it, but she still might think of something, if only the Aes Sedai would give her time enough away from ter'angreal. As Accepted, she supposedly could take her studies where she wanted, but if they thought I could eat and show them how to make ter'angreal at the same time, I wouldn't have a minute to myself. At least there would be a break in that tomorrow. Shifting to her bed, Nynaeve frowned and fiddled with the Idam bracelet on her wrist. She always insisted one of them wear it, even when they slept, though it produced decidedly odd and unpleasant dreams. There was hardly need. The Idam would hold Mogedion just as well hanging on a peg, and on top of that, she shared a truly tiny cubbyhole with Birgitta. Birgitta was as good a guard as could be, and besides, Mogedion almost wept any time Birgitta so much as frowned. She had the least reason to want Mogedion alive, the most to want her dead, which the woman knew very well. Tonight the bracelet would be less use than usual. "Nynaeve, they'll be waiting!" Nynaeve sniffed loudly. She did not do well being at anyone's beck and call, but she took one of two flattened stone rings from the table between the beds. Both too large for a finger, one was striped and flecked blue and brown, the other blue and red, and each was twisted, so it had only one edge. Unfastening the leather thong hanging around her neck, Nynaeve threaded the blue and brown ring alongside another, heavy and gold, Lan's signet. She touched the thick gold band tenderly before tucking both inside her shift. Elaine picked up the blue and red ring, frowning at it. The rings were ter'angreal she had made in imitation of one now in Suan's possession, and despite their simple appearance, they were complex beyond belief. Sleeping with one next to your skin would take you into Tel'aran'rhiod, the world of dreams, a reflection of the real world, perhaps of all worlds. Some Aes Sedai claimed that there were many worlds, as if all variations of the pattern had to exist, and that all those worlds together made up a still larger pattern. The important thing was that Tel'aran'rhiod reflected this world and had properties that were extremely useful, especially since the tower knew nothing of entering it, so far as they could discover. Neither of these rings worked quite as well as the original, though they did work. Elaine was getting a little better at that. Of 4 attempts to produce a copy, only 1 had been a failure. A much better average than with the things she made from scratch. But what if one of her failures did worse than simply not work, or not work very well? Aes Sedai had been stilled studying ter'angreal. Burned out, it was called, when it happened by accident, yet it was just as final. Nynaeve did not think so, of course, but Nynaeve would not be satisfied till she healed somebody 3 days dead. Elaine turned the ring in her fingers. What it did was simple enough to understand, but the how still escaped her. How and why were the keys. With the rings, she thought the pattern of colors had as much to do with it as the shape. Anything other than the twisted ring did nothing, and the one that had turned out solid blue just gave you horrific nightmares. But she was not sure how to reproduce the original's red, blue, and brown. Yet the fine structure of her copies was the same, the way the tiniest bits of them, too small to see or even detect without the one power, were arranged. Why should the colors matter? There seemed to be one common thread in those tiny structures for ter'angreal that required channeling to work, and another for those that simply made use of the power. Stumbling on that was what allowed her to even attempt to make original ter'angreal. But there was so much she did not know, so much she was guessing at. "Are you going to sit there all night?" Nynaeve asked dryly, and Elaine gave a start. Setting one of the pottery cups back on the table, Nynaeve arranged herself on her bed, hands folded across her middle. "You were the one who mentioned not keeping them waiting. For myself, I don't mean to give those biddies an excuse to chew my tail feathers." Hastily, Elaine slipped the speckled ring. It was not really stone anymore, though it had started out that way, onto a cord that she tied around her own neck. The second pottery cup also held a tincture of herbs that Nynaeve had prepared, slightly sweetened with honey to negate a bitter taste. Elaine drank about half, from past experience, enough to help her sleep even with a headache. Tonight was one of those nights she could not afford to dally. Stretching out on the cramped bed, she channeled briefly to extinguish the candle, then flapped her shift to produce a little cool. Well, a stir in the air, anyway. "I wish Egwene would get better. I am tired of the scraps Sheriam and the rest of them toss us. I want to know what is happening." She had touched on a hazardous topic, she realized. Egwene had been injured a month and a half ago in Cairhien, on the day Moiraine and Lanfear died, the day Lan vanished. The wise ones say she is getting better, Nynaeve murmured sleepily in the dark. For once she did not sound as if she had followed the path to Lan. That's what Shiriam and her little circle say, and they have no reason to lie, even if they could. Well, I wish I could look over Shiriam's shoulder tomorrow night. As well wish... Nynaeve stopped for a yawn. As well wish the Hall will choose you Amerlin while you're about it. You might have that one granted. By the time they choose anyone, we'll both be gray-haired enough for the job. Elaine opened her mouth to reply, but with the other woman's example, it turned into a yawn, too. Nynaeve began to snore, not loudly, but with dogged persistence. Elaine let her eyes drift shut, but her thoughts tried to remain focused in spite of herself. The hall certainly was being dilatory, the sitters meeting for less than an hour some days, and often not at all. To talk to one, you would think she saw no urgency, though of course the sitters for the 6 Ajahs, there were no Reds in Salidar, of course, did not tell other Aes Sedai what they discussed in session, much less an accepted. They certainly had cause for dispatch. If their intentions remained secret, their gathering surely no longer did. Elida and the Tower would not ignore them forever. Beyond that, the White Cloaks were still only a few miles away in Amadisia, and rumors had begun of Dragonsworn right here in Altara. The Light alone knew what Dragonsworn might get up to if Rand had no control over them. The Prophet was a good example, or rather a horrid one. Riots, homes and farms burned, people murdered for not showing enough fervor in support of the Dragon Reborn. Nynaeve's snoring sounded like cloth ripping. Another yawn cracked Elaine's jaws. She turned on her side and snuggled into the thin pillow. Reasons for dispatch. Samael sat in Ilion, and it was only a few hundred miles to the Ilianer border, far too close with one of the Forsaken. The Light alone knew where the other Forsaken were, or what they were scheming. And Rand. They had to be concerned about Rand. He was not a danger, of course. He could never be that. But he was the key to everything. The world truly did bend itself around him now. She would bond him somehow. Min. She and the embassy had to be more than halfway to Camelin by now. No snows to slow them. Another month yet for them to arrive. Not that she was concerned about Min going to Rand. What was the girl thinking of? Min. Sleep slid over her, and she slid into Telairan Riod, and found herself standing in the main street of silent, night-shrouded Salidar with the moon gibbous overhead. She could see quite clearly, more so than moonlight alone would have allowed. There was always a sense of light in the world of dreams, from everywhere and nowhere, as if the darkness itself had some dark glow. But then dreams were like that, and this was a dream, if not any ordinary dream. The village here reflected the real Salidar, but in strange facsimile, more still than even night would make it. Every window was dark, and an air of emptiness hung heavily, as if no one occupied any of the buildings. Of course, no one did here. A nightbird's reedy cry was answered by another, then a third, and something made a faint rustling noise as it skittered away in the odd half-light. But the stables would be empty, and the picket lines outside the village, and the clearings where sheep and cattle had been gathered. Wild creatures there would be in plenty, but none domesticated. Details changed between one glance and the next. The thatch-roofed buildings remained the same, yet a water barrel would be in a slightly different place, or gone. A door that had stood open was closed. The more ephemeral a thing was in the real world, the more its position or condition might change, the less firm its reflection. Occasionally, motion flickered in the dark street, someone appearing and vanishing after a few steps, or even floating across the ground as if flying. Many people's dreams could touch Telairan Riod, but only briefly, which was lucky for them. Another property of the world of dreams was that what happened to you here was still real when you woke. If you died here, you did not wake. A strange reflection. Only the heat was the same. Nynaeve stood there in an accepted's white dress with the banded hem, impatient beside Swan and Lyanna. She had the silver bracelet, too, though it would not work from here to the waking world. It still held Moghedian, but Nynaeve, out of her body, would not be feeling anything through it. Lyanna was regally slim, though in Elaine's opinion her barely opaque Damani gown of thin silk detracted from her elegance. The color kept shifting, too. That sort of thing happened until you learned what you were doing here. Swan was better. She wore a simple dress of blue silk, with a scooped neck just low enough to show the twisted ring on a necklace. On the other hand, lace trim sometimes appeared on the dress, and the necklace changed from a plain silver chain to elaborate pieces with rubies or fire drops or emeralds set in gold, with earrings to match, then back to the plain chain. That was the original ring hanging around Swan's neck. She appeared as solid as any of the buildings. To herself, Elaine looked just as solid, but she knew that to the others she seemed slightly misty, like Nynaeve and Lyanna. You almost thought you might see the moonlight through them. That was what using a copy did. She could sense the true source, but as she was, Saidar felt tenuous. If she tried to channel, that would be meager too. With the ring Swan wore, it would not be so, but that was the price of having secrets someone else knew and you did not dare have exposed. Swan trusted the original more than Elaine's copies, so she wore it, or sometimes Lyanna did, while Elaine and Nynaeve, who could use Saidar, made do. "Where are they?" Swan demanded. Her neckline swooped up and down. The dress was green now, the necklace a strand of fat moonstones. "It's bad enough they want to stick an oar into my work and row as they please. Now they make me wait." "I do not know why it upsets you for them to come along," Lyanna told her. "You like watching them make mistakes. They do not know half of what they think they do." For a moment her gown slid dangerously close to transparency. A close twerk of fat pearls appeared around her neck and vanished.
Hey, Fire, how you doing?
She had even less experience here than Swan. "I need some real sleep."
I didn't have too bad a day. I can't
Bryn
complain
tries
too
to run me
much.
breathless, but I have to wait on the pleasure of women who will spend half the night remembering how to walk. Not to mention being lumbered with these two. She frowned at Elaine and Nynaeve, then rolled her eyes skyward. Nynaeve gripped her braid firmly, a sure indication of temper working. For once, Elaine agreed with her wholeheartedly. It was more than difficult being a teacher with pupils who thought they knew more than they did, and were far more likely to call down the teacher than the teacher was to get away with calling them down. Of course, the others were far worse than Swan or Lyanna. Where were the others? Movement appeared up the street. 6 women surrounded by the glow of Saidar, who did not vanish. As usual, Sheriam and the rest of her council had dreamed themselves into their own bedchambers and walked out. Elaine was not sure how far they understood the attributes of Tel'aran'rhiod Riod yet. In any case, they often insisted on doing things their own way, even when there was a better. Who could know better than an Aes Sedai? The 6 Aes Sedai truly were beginners in Tel'aran'rhiod Riod, and their dresses changed every time Elaine looked at them. First, one was wearing the embroidered Aes Sedai shawl fringed in the color of her Aja, and with the white flame of Tar Valon a bold teardrop on the back. Then 4 were, then none. Sometimes it was a light traveling cloak, as to keep dust off, with the flame on back and left breast. Their ageless faces showed no signs of the heat, of course. Aes Sedai never did, and no sign they were aware of how their clothes were changing either. They were as misty as Nynaeve or Lyanna. Sheriam and the others put more faith in dream ter'angreal that required channeling than in the rings. They just did not seem willing to believe that Tel'aran'rhiod had nothing to do with the ones else. At least Elaine could not tell which were using her copies. Somewhere about them, 3 would have a small disk of what had once been iron, scribed on both sides with a tight spiral and powered by a flow of spirit, the only one of the 5 powers that could be channeled in your sleep. Except here, anyway. The other 3 would be carrying small plaques, once amber, with a sleeping woman worked inside each. Even if she had all 6 ter'angreal in front of her, Elaine would not have been able to pick out the 2 originals. Those copies had gone very well. Just the same, it was still copying. As the
I'll
Aes
be right
Sedai
back.
came down the dirt street together, she heard the tail end of their conversation, though she could not make head nor foot of it. "We'll scorn our choice, Carlinia," fiery-haired Shiriam was saying, "but they will scorn any choice we make. We might as well stay by our decision. You do not need me to list reasons again." Morvrin, a stout brown sister with gray-streaked hair, snorted. "After all our work with the Hall, we would have a hard time changing their minds now." "As long as no ruler scoffs, why should we care?" Mirella said heatedly. The youngest of the six, not many years Aes Sedai, she sounded decidedly irritated. "What ruler would dare?" Anaya asked, much like a woman asking what child would dare track mud on her carpets. "In any case, no king or queen knows enough of what passes among Aes Sedai to understand. Only the sisters' opinions need concern us, not theirs." "What worries me," Carlinia replied coolly, "is that if she is easily guided by us, she may be as easily guided by others." The pale, almost black-eyed white was always cool, some would say icy. Whatever they were talking about, it was nothing they wanted to discuss in front of Elaine or the others. They fell silent just before reaching them. Swan and Lyanna's reaction to the newcomers had been to turn their backs on each other sharply, as if they had been having words interrupted by the Aes Sedai's arrival. For Elaine's part, she quickly checked her dress. It was the proper banded white. She did not know how she felt about that, appearing in the right dress without thought. She would have wagered that Nynaeve had had to change her garb after appearing. But then Nynaeve was far more intrepid than she, struggling against limits that she herself acquiesced to. How could she ever manage to rule Andor? If her mother was dead. If. Shiriam, slightly plump and with high cheekbones, turned tilted green eyes on Swan and Lyanna. For a moment she wore a blue-fringed shawl. "If you two cannot learn to get along, I vow I'll send both of you to Tiana." It had the sound of something said often and no longer really meant. "You worked together long enough," Baonin said in her heavy Tarraboner accent. A pretty gray with honey-colored hair and a multitude of braids, she had blue-gray eyes that constantly looked startled. Nothing surprised Baonin, though. She would not believe the sun came up in the morning until she saw for herself. Yet if one morning it did not, Elaine doubted that Baonin would turn a hair. It would just confirm that she'd been right to demand proof.
Yeah.
"You can and must work together again." Baonin sounded as if she'd said that so often that she hardly thought of it.
I think he jumped from there.
All the Aes Sedai were long since used to Swan and Lyanna. They had begun handling them as they might have managed two girls who could not stop squabbling. Aes Sedai did have a tendency to see anyone who was not as a child. Even these two, who once had been sisters.
He didn't really get spanked for it, but he did get
"Send them to Tiana or don't," Mirella snapped. "But don't talk about it."
Yelled at.
Elaine did not think the darkly beautiful woman was angry at Swan or Lyanna, perhaps not at anyone or anything in particular. She had a volatile temper remarkable even among greens. Her golden yellow silk dress became high-necked, but with an oval cutout that exposed the tops of her breasts. She wore a peculiar necklace, too, like a wide silver collar supporting 3 small daggers, hilts nestling in her cleavage. A 4th dagger appeared and was gone so quickly it might have been imagination. She eyed Nynaeve up and down as if searching for fault. "Are we going to the tower, or aren't we? If we are going to do this, we might as well accomplish something useful while we are about it." Elaine knew why Mirella was angry now. When she and Nynaeve first came to Salidar, they had been meeting Egwene in Tel Aranriod every 7 days to share what they had learned, which had not always been easy, since Egwene was always accompanied by at least one of the Aiel Dreamwalkers she was studying with. Meeting without a wise one or two had taken some pains. In any case, all that ended when they reached Salidar. 6 Aes Sedai of Shiriam's council had taken over the meetings, when they had had only the 3 original Terangrial and little more knowledge of Tel Aranriod than how to reach it. That had been just when Egwene was injured, which left Aes Sedai facing wise ones, 2 sets of proud, resolute women, each suspicious of what the other wanted, neither willing to yield an inch or bow her neck a hair. Of course, Elaine did not know what went on at those meetings, but she had her own experiences to go by, and fragments dropped here and there by Shiriam and the others. Aes Sedai were sure they could learn anything once they knew there was something to be learned, usually required the respect due a queen, and always expected to be told what they wanted to know without delays or quibbles. They had apparently demanded answers about everything, from what Rand was planning, to when Egwene would be well enough to return to the world of dreams, to whether it was possible to spy on people's dreams in Tel Riod, or to enter the world of dreams physically, or bring someone into the dream against their will. They'd even asked more than once whether it was possible to affect the real world by what you did in the dream, a pure impossibility they apparently doubted. Morvrin had read a little about Tel Riod, enough to come up with plenty of questions, though Elaine suspected Swan supplied her share. She thought Swan was angling to attend the meetings herself, but the Aes Sedai seemed to think it concession enough to allow her to use the ring as an aid in her work with the eyes and ears. Aes Sedai interference in that work was what upset her. As for the Aiel, wise ones, the Dreamwalkers at least, Elaine was aware from her own encounters, not only knew just about everything there was to know about the world of dreams, but looked on it almost as a private preserve. They did not like anyone covering their influence, and had a rough way of dealing with what they saw as foolishness. Besides which, a close-mouthed lot, apparently fiercely loyal to Rand, unwilling to say much more than that he was alive, or that Egwene would return to Tel Riod when she was well enough, and more than unwilling to answer questions they considered improper. Which last could mean that they did not believe the questioner knew enough yet to hear the answer, or that question or answer or both somehow violated their strange philosophy of honor and obligation. Elaine knew little more of Ji'eto than that it existed, and that it made for very peculiar, very touchy behavior. All in all, it was a recipe for disaster, and Elaine thought it very probably was served up fresh every 7 days, at least from the Aes Sedai point of view. Shiriam and the other 5 had required lessons every night in the beginning, but now there were only 2 times they did so. The night before meeting the wise ones, as if to hone their skills one last time before a contest, and the night after, usually tight-mouthed, as if to work out what had gone wrong and how to counter it. Mirella was probably already seething over tomorrow night's disaster. There surely would be one of some kind. Morvrin turned to Mirella and opened her mouth, but suddenly there was another woman among them. It took Elaine a moment to recognize Gera, one of the cooks, ageless features. Wearing a green-fringed shawl with the flame of Tar Valon on her back, and weighing no more than half what she really did, Gera raised an admonitory finger to the Aes Sedai, and was gone. "So those are her dreams, are they?" Carlinia said coolly. Her snow-white silk dress grew sleeves that hung in points over her hands, and a high, tight neck under her chin. Someone should speak to her. "Leave over, Carlinia," Anaya chuckled. "Gera's a good cook. Let her have her dreams. I can see the attraction myself." Abruptly, she became slimmer and taller. Her features did not really alter. She wore the same plain, motherly face as always. With a laugh, she changed back. "Can't you see the fun in something for once, Carlinia?" Even Carlinia's sniff was cool. "Clearly," Morvrin said, "Gera saw us, but will she remember?" Her dark, steely eyes were thoughtful. Her dress, plain dark wool, held the steadiest among the 6. Details shifted, but so subtly that Elaine could not really say what was different. "Of course she will," Nynaeve said acerbically. She had explained this before. 6 Aes Sedai looked at her, eyebrows rising, and she moderated her voice. A little. She hated scrubbing pots, too. "If she remembers the dream, she will, but only as a dream." Morvrin frowned. She ran Bayan a close second in wanting proof. Nynaeve's long-suffering expression was going to get her in trouble, whatever her tone. Before Elaine could say anything to take the Aes Sedai's attention from Nynaeve, though, Lyanna spoke up with an expression close to a simper. "Don't you think we should go now?" Swan snorted contemptuously at the timidity, and Liana cut her eyes at her sharply. Yes, you'll want to have as much time in the tower as possible, Swan said, diffident in turn, and Liana sniffed. They really did it very well. Shiriam and the others never suspected that Swan and Liana were not simply two stilled women clinging to a purpose that might keep them alive, clinging to the edge of what they had been. Two women childishly at one another's throats all the time. The Aes Sedai should have remembered that Swan had had the reputation of a strong-willed and devious manipulator, and to a lesser extent so had Liana. Had they presented a unified front or shown their true faces, the six would have remembered and looked hard at everything the pair said. But divided, spitting rancor in each other, all but groveling to the Aes Sedai and plainly not even aware of it. When one was reluctantly forced to agree with what the other said, it lent extra weight. When one objected on obviously frivolous grounds, so did that. Elaine knew they used the pretense to guide Shiriam and the others towards supporting Rand. She just wished she knew what else they used it for. They're right, Nynaeve said firmly, giving Swan and Liana a disgusted look. Their pretense irked Nynaeve no end. Nynaeve would not have groveled for her life. You should know by now that the longer you spend here, the less real rest you get. Sleep while you were in Tel Riyadh doesn't do as much good as ordinary sleep. Now remember that if you see anything out of the ordinary, you need to be careful. She truly did hate repeating herself. The fact showed clearly in her voice. But with these women, Elaine had to admit it was too often necessary. If only Nynaeve did not sound as if she were talking to dim-witted children. When somebody dreams themselves into Tel Riyadh like Gera, but they're having a nightmare, sometimes the nightmare survives, and those are very dangerous. Avoid anything that looks unusual, and try to control your thoughts this time. What you think of here can become real. That Murdral that popped out of nowhere last time might have been a leftover nightmare, but I think one of you let her mind wander. You were talking about the Black Adja, if you'll remember, and discussing whether they were letting Shadow spawn into the tower. As if that were not bad enough, she had to add, you won't impress the wise ones tomorrow night if you drop a Murdral into the middle of everything. Elaine winced. Child, Anaya said gently, adjusting the blue-fringed shawl that was suddenly looped over her arms. You have been doing very good work, but that doesn't excuse a peevish mouth. You have been given a number of privileges, Mirella said, not at all gently, but you seem to forget that they are privileges. Her frown should have been enough to make Nynaeve quake. Mirella had been increasingly hard on Nynaeve the past weeks. She had her shawl on, too. They all did. A bad sign. Morvran snorted bluntly. When I was accepted, any girl who spoke to an Aes Sedai that way would have spent the next month scrubbing floors if she was due to be raised Aes Sedai the next day. Elaine spoke up hurriedly, hoping she could forestall their own disaster. Nynaeve had put on what she probably thought was a conciliatory face, but she looked sulky and stubborn. I am sure she didn't mean anything, Aes Sedai. We have been working very hard. Please forgive us. Adding herself might help, since she had done nothing. It might also have them both scrubbing floors. At least it made Nynaeve look at her. And think, apparently, since her features smoothed into something that did seem appeasing, and she made a curtsy and stared at the ground as though abashed. Maybe she really was. Maybe. Elaine rushed on as if Nynaeve had made a formal apology and had it accepted. I know you all do want to spend as much time as possible at the tower, so perhaps we shouldn't wait any longer? If you will all visualize Elida's study, just as you saw it last time? Elida was never called the Amerlin in Salidar, and in the same way the Amerlin's study in the White Tower had its name shifted. Everyone fix it in your minds, so we all arrive
right
together.
back, everyone.
Anaya was the first to nod, but even Carlinia and Theonin let themselves be diverted. It was unclear whether the 10 of them moved or Tel Riyadh moved around them. It could have been either, from the little Elaine really understood. The world of dreams was almost infinitely malleable. One moment they were standing in the street in Salidar, the next in a large and ornate room.
Spot.
The Aes Sedai gave satisfied nods, still inexperienced enough to be pleased at anything that worked as they thought it should. As surely as Tel'aran'rhiod reflected the waking world, this room reflected the power of the women who had occupied it over the last 3,000 years. The gilded stand lamps were unlit, but there was light in the odd way of Tel'aran'rhiod and dreams. The tall fireplace was golden marble from Kandor, the floor polished redstone from the mountains of mist. The walls had been paneled a relatively short time ago, a mere 1,000 years, in pale wood, oddly striped and carved with marvelous beasts and birds that Elaine was sure had come straight out of the carver's imagination. Gleaming pearly stone framed tall arched windows that led onto the balcony overlooking the Amerlin's private garden. That stone had been salvaged from a nameless city submerged in the sea of storms during the breaking of the world, and no one had ever found its like elsewhere. Each woman who used that room put her own mark on it, if only for the time of her possession, and Elida was no different. A heavy throne-like chair, an ivory flame of Tarvalin cresting the high back, stood behind a massive writing table ornately carved in triple-linked rings. The tabletop was bare except for 3 boxes of Altaran lacquer work, each precisely the same distance from the next. A plain white vase stood atop a severe white plinth against one wall. The vase held roses, the number and color changing at every look, but always arranged with a harsh rigidity. Roses, at this time of year, in this weather. The one power had been wasted to make them grow. Elida had done the same when she was advisor to Elaine's mother. Above the fireplace hung a painting in the new style on stretched canvas of 2 men fighting among clouds, hurling lightning. One man had a face of fire, and the other was Rand. Elaine had been at Falma. The painting was not too far from the truth. A tear in the canvas across Rand's face, as though something heavy had been thrown at it, had been mended almost invisibly. Plainly, Elida wanted a constant reminder of the dragon reborn, and just as plainly, she was not happy having to look at it. "If you will excuse me," Liana said before all the satisfied nodding was done, "I must see if my people have received my messages." Every Aja except the white had a network of eyes and ears scattered across the nations, and so did a good many individual Aes Sedai, but Liana was rare, perhaps unique, in that as keeper she had created a net in Tarvalin itself. No sooner had she spoken than she vanished. "She should not be wandering about alone here," Shiriam said in an exasperated voice. "Nynaeve, go after her. Stay with her." Nynaeve gave her braid a tug. "I don't think very often you do not," Mirella cut her off. "For once, do as you are told when you are told. Accepted?" Exchanging wry glances with Elaine, Nynaeve nodded, visibly suppressing a sigh, and disappeared. Elaine had little sympathy. Had Nynaeve not indulged her irritation back in Salidar, it might have been possible to explain that Liana could be anywhere in the city, that it would be almost impossible to find her, and that she'd been venturing into Tel'aran'rhiod alone for weeks.
Hey, Soy, how you doing?
"Now to see what we can learn," Morvran
That
said.
time again.
But before anyone could move, Elida was behind the writing table, glaring. An unyielding, stern-faced woman, handsome rather than beautiful, and dark of hair and eye, Elida wore a blood-red dress, with the striped stole of the Amerlin's seat about her shoulders. "As I have foretold," she intoned, "the White Tower will be reunited under me."
Meeting time.
"Under me." She pointed harshly to the floor. "Kneel and ask forgiveness of your sins." With that, she was gone. Elaine let out a long breath and was gratified to realize she was not the only one. "A foretelling?" Beonin's voice creased thoughtfully. She did not sound worried, but she might well have. Elida did have the foretelling, if fitfully. When the foretelling laid hold of a woman and she knew a thing would happen, it did. "A dream," Elaine said, and was surprised at how steady her voice was. "She's asleep and dreaming. No wonder if she dreams everything to her. Please, light. "Did you notice the stole?" Anaya asked no one in particular. "It had no blue stripe." The Amerlin's stole was supposed to have 1 stripe for each of the 7. "A dream," Miriam said flatly. She sounded unafraid, but she had her blue-fringed shawl on again and was clutching it around her. So was Anaya. "Whether it is or not," Morvran said placidly, "we may as well do what we came for." Not much could frighten Morvran. The abrupt stir of activity at the Brown sisters' words made it suddenly clear how still everyone had gone. She, Carlinia, and Anaya glided swiftly out to the anteroom where the keeper's work table would be. That was Alviarin Frieden under Elida. A white, strangely, though the keeper always came from the Amerlin's own Aja.
1 second.
Swan stared after them testily. She claimed there was often more to be learned from Alviarin's papers than from Elida's, for Alviarin sometimes seemed to know more than the woman she supposedly served, and twice Swan had found evidence that Alviarin had countermanded Elida's orders, apparently without repercussions. Not that she had told Elaine or Nynaeve what orders. There were definite limits to Swan's sharing it. Shiriam, Baonin, and Mirella gathered at Elida's desk, opened one of the lacquered boxes, and began rifling through the papers inside. Elida kept her recent correspondence and reports there. The box, worked in golden hawks fighting among white clouds in a blue sky, would suddenly shut again every time one of them let go of the lid, until they remembered to hold it open, and the papers themselves changed even as they were being read. Paper truly was ephemeral. Amid vexed tisks and annoyed sighs, the Aes Sedai persevered. "Here's a report from Danella," Mirella said, hastily scanning a page. Swan tried to join them. Danella, a young brown, had been part of the cabal that deposed her, but Baonin gave her a sharp frown that sent her back to a corner, grumbling to herself. Baonin had returned her attention to the box and its documents before Swan had taken 3 steps. The other 2 women never noticed. Mirella went right on talking. "She says that Matin Stepaneus accepts wholeheartedly. Roadrun is still trying to take every side, while Aleandra and Tylin want more time to consider their answers. There's a note here in Elida's hand. Press them." She clicked her tongue as the report melted into air in her hand. "It did not say about what, but there can be only 2 possibilities to take in those 4. Matin Stepaneus was king of Ilion, and Roadrun of Mirundi, while Aleandra was queen of Gildan and Tylin of Altara. The subject had to be Rand, or the Aes Sedai opposing Elida. "At least we know our emissaries still have as good a chance as Elida's," Shiriam said. Of course, Salidar had sent none to Matin Stepaneus. Lord Brend of the Council of 9, Samael, was the true power in Ilion. Elaine would have given a pretty penny to know what Elida proposed that Samael was willing to support, or at least let Matin Stepaneus say that he would support. She was sure the 3 Aes Sedai would have given as much, but they just went on snatching documents out of the lacquerwork box. "The arrest warrant for Moiraine, it is still in force," Baonin said, shaking her head as the sheet in her hand suddenly turned to a fat sheaf. "She does not yet know Moiraine is dead." Grimacing at the pages, she let them fall. They scattered like leaves and melted into air before settling. "Elida still means to build herself a palace, too." "She would," Shiriam said dryly. Her hand jerked as she took in what appeared to be a short note. "Shemarin has run away. The accepted Shemarin." All 3 glanced at Elaine before turning back to the box, which they had to open again. None made any comment on what Shiriam had said. Elaine very nearly ground her teeth. She and Nynaeve had told them Elida was reducing Shemarin, a yellow sister, to the accepted, but of course they had not believed. An Aes Sedai could be made to do penance, she might be cast out, but she could not be demoted short of stilling. Only it seemed that Elida was doing exactly that, whatever Tower law said. Maybe she was rewriting Tower law. A number of things they had told these women had not really been believed. Such young women, accepted, could not know enough of the world to know what could be and what not. Young women were credulous, gullible. They might well see and believe what was not there at all. It was an effort not to stamp her foot. An accepted took what Aes Sedai wished to hand out and did not ask for what Aes Sedai did not choose to give, such as apologies. She kept her face smooth and her smoldering inside. Swan felt under no such restraints. Most of the time she did not. When the Aes Sedai were not looking at her, she bathed them all in a glower. Of course, if one of the three glanced in her direction, her face became meek acceptance in a twinkling. She was very practiced at that. A lion survives by being a lion, she had once told Elaine, and a mouse by being a mouse. Even so, Swan made a poor and reluctant mouse. Elaine thought she detected worry in Swan's eyes. This task had been Swan's since she proved to the Aes Sedai that she could use the ring safely. After secret lessons for her and Lyanna from Nynaeve and Elaine, true, and a prime source of information. It took time to re-establish contact with eyes and ears scattered across the nations and redirect their reports from the tower to Salidar. If Shiriam and the others meant to take this over, Swan might be less useful. In the history of the tower, no network of agents had ever been run by any but a full sister, until Swan came to Salidar with her knowledge of the Amerlin's eyes and ears, and the blue Ajas that she had run before becoming Amerlin. Bayanin and Carlinia were openly reluctant to depend on a woman who was no longer one of them, and the others were not far behind. Truth to tell, they were none of them comfortable around a woman who had been stilled. There really was nothing for Elaine to do either. The Aes Sedai might call this a lesson, they might even think of it so, but she knew from past experience that if she tried to do any teaching without being asked, she would have her nose snapped off in short order. She was there to answer any questions they might have, and nothing more. She thought of a stool. It appeared, the legs carved in vines, and sat down to wait. A chair would have been more comfortable, but it might occasion comment. An accepted sitting too comfortably was often considered an accepted with not enough to do. After a moment, Swan made herself an almost identical stool. She gave Elaine a tight smile, and the Aes Sedai backs a scowl. The first time Elaine had visited this room in Tel Riyadh, there had been a semicircle of such stools, a dozen or more in front of the heavily carved table. Each visit since had seen fewer, and now none. She was sure that indicated something, though she could not imagine what. She was sure Swan thought so too, and very likely had puzzled out a reason, but if she had not shared it with Elaine or Nynaeve. The fighting in Shinar and Arafel is dying down, Shiriam murmured half to herself, but still nothing here to say why it began. Skirmishes only, yet bordermen do not fight one another. They have the blight. She was Saldaean, and Saldaea was one of the borderlands. At least the blight is still quiet, Mirella said. Almost too quiet. It cannot last. A good thing that Elida has plenty of eyes and ears through the borderlands. Swan managed to combine a wince with a glare at the Aes Sedai. Elaine did not think she had managed yet to make contact with any of her agents in the borderlands. They lay a long way from Salidar. I would feel better if the same could be said of Tarabon. The page in Bayanin's hand grew longer and wider. He glanced at it, sniffed, and tossed it aside. The eyes and ears in Tarabon, they are still silent. All of them. The only word she has of Tarabon is rumors from Amadisia that Aes Sedai are involved in the war. She shook her head at the absurdity of committing such rumors to paper. Aes Sedai did not involve themselves in civil wars, not openly enough to be detected, at any rate. And there are no more than a handful of confused reports from Arad Doman, it seems. We will know about Tarabon soon enough ourselves, Shiriam said soothingly. A few more weeks. The search went on for hours. There was never any shortage of documents. The lacquered box never emptied. In fact, the stack inside sometimes increased with the removal of a paper. Of course, only the shortest held steady long enough to be read in full, but occasionally a letter or report that had already been scanned would come out of the box again. Long stretches passed in silence, yet some documents elicited comment. A few the Aes Sedai discussed. Swan began stringing a cat's cradle between her hands, apparently paying no attention at all. Elaine wished she could do the same, or better yet, a book appeared on the floor at her feet, The Travels of Jane Farstrider, before she made it go away. But women who were not Aes Sedai were granted more leeway than those training to be. Still, she learned a few things by listening. Aes Sedai involvement in Tarabon was not the only rumor that had found its way to Elida's writing table. Pedro Niles' ingathering of the White Cloaks was rumored to have as its goal everything from seizing the throne of Amadisia, which he certainly had no need of, to crushing the wars and anarchy in Tarabon and Arad Doman, to supporting Rand. Elaine would believe that when the sun rose in the west. There were reports of strange occurrences in Ilion and Cairhien. There might have been others, but those were the ones they saw. Villages taken by madness, nightmares walking in daylight, two-headed calves that talked, shadow spawn appearing out of thin air. Shiriam and the other two passed over those lightly. The same sort of stories drifted to Salidar from parts of Altara and Murundi, and across the river from Amadisia. The Aes Sedai dismissed them as hysteria among people learning of the Dragon Reborn. Elaine was not so sure. She had seen things they had not, for all their years and experience. Her mother was rumored to be raising an army in the west of Andor, under the ancient flag of Manetherin of all things, as well as being held prisoner by Rand and fleeing to every nation imaginable, including the Borderlands and Amadisia, which last was purely unimaginable. Apparently the Tower believed none of it. Elaine wished she knew what to believe. She stopped fretting over where her mother really was when she heard Shiriam mention her name. Not speaking to her, reading hurriedly from a square sheet of paper that became a long parchment with 3 seals at the bottom. Elaine Trakand was to be located and returned to the White Tower at all costs. If there was any more bungling, those who failed would envy the Makura woman. That made Elaine shiver. On their way to Salidar, a woman named Rhonda Makura had come within an eyelash of sending her and Nynaeve back to the tower, like bundles of wash to the laundry. The ruling house of Andor, Shiriam read, was the key, which made as little sense. The key to what? None of the 3 Aes Sedai so much as glanced in her direction. They just exchanged glances and went on with what they were doing. Perhaps they had forgotten her, but then again, perhaps not. Aes Sedai did what they did. If she was to be shielded from Elida, that was an Aes Sedai decision, and if they decided for some reason to hand her to Elida bound hand and foot, that was their choice too. The pike does not ask for father's permission before dining, as she remembered Linny saying. Elida's response to Rand's amnesty was evident in the condition of the report. Elaine could almost see her crumpling the sheet of paper in her fist, starting to rip it apart, then coldly smoothing it out and adding it to the box. Elida's rages were almost always cold. She had not written anything on that document, but scrawled biting words on another, enumerating the Aes Sedai in the tower, made clear she was almost ready to declare publicly that any who did not obey her order to return were traitors. Shiriam and the other 2 discussed the possibility calmly. However many sisters intended to obey, some would have far to travel. Some might not even have received the summons yet. In any case, such a decree would confirm to the world all the rumors of a divided tower. Elida must be near panic to consider such a thing, or else maddened beyond reason. A sliver of cold slid down Elaine's backbone, and nothing to do with whether Elida was fearful or engaged. 294 Aes Sedai in the tower supporting Elida. Nearly 1/3 of all Aes Sedai, almost as many as had gathered in Salidar. It might be that the best that could be expected was for the rest to split down the middle as well. After a great rush in the beginning, the numbers coming into Salidar had slowed to a trickle. Perhaps the flow to the tower had dwindled as well. It could be hoped. For a time, they did their searching in silence. Then Beonin exclaimed, "Elida, she has sent emissaries to Randall Thor." Elaine leaped to her feet and barely held her tongue at a clutching gesture from Swan, spoiled a little by her failure to make the cat's cradle disappear first. Shiriam reached for the single sheet, but it became 3 before her hand touched it. "Where is she sending them?" she asked, at the same time Mirel asked, "When did they leave Tar Valon?" Serenity hung on by its fingernails. "To Cairhien," Beonin said. "And I did not see when, if it was mentioned. But they certainly will go on to Caemlyn as soon as they discover where he is." Even so, that was good. It might take a month or more to travel from Cairhien to Caemlyn. The Salidar embassy would reach him first, surely. Elaine had a ragged map tucked away beneath her mattress back in Salidar, and every day she marked off how far she thought they might have traveled toward Camelin. The Grey sister was not finished. It seems that Elida, she means to offer him support, and an escort to the tower. Shiriam's eyebrows rose. That is preposterous. Mirella's olive cheeks darkened. Elida was red. An Amerlin was of all Ajas and none, yet no one could simply abandon where they came from. That woman will do anything, Shiriam said. He might find the White Tower's support attractive. Perhaps we can send a message to Egwene through the Aiel women, Mirella suggested in a doubtful tone. Swan gave a loud and very phony cough, but Elaine had had all she could stand. Warning Egwene was vital, of course. Elida's people would surely drag her back to the tower if they discovered her in Cairhien, and not to a pleasant reception. But the rest... How can you think Rand would listen to anything Elida says? Do you think he does not know she was Red Aja and what that means? They aren't going to offer him support, and you know it. We have to warn him. There was a contradiction in that, and she knew it, but worry had hold of her tongue. If anything happened to Rand, she would die. And how do you suggest that we do that, accepted? Shiriam asked coolly. Elaine was afraid she must look like a fish with her mouth hanging open. She had not a clue what answer to give. She was saved suddenly by distant screaming, followed by wordless shouts from the anteroom. She was closest to the door, but she ran through with the others on her heels. The room was empty except for the keeper's writing table, with its piles of papers and stacks of scrolls and documents, and a row of chairs against one wall where Aes Sedai would sit while waiting to speak to Elida. Anaya, Morvrin, and Carlinia were gone, but one of the tall outer doors was still swinging shut. A woman's frantic screams rolled through the narrowing opening. Shiriam, Mirella, and Baonin almost knocked Elaine down in their haste to reach the hall. They might have appeared misty, but they felt solid enough. "Be careful," Elaine shouted. Yet there was really nothing to do but gather her skirts and follow as quickly as possible with Swan. They stepped into a scene from nightmare. Literally. Some 30 paces to their right, the tapestry-hung corridor suddenly widened into a stony cavern that seemed to stretch forever, lit in dim patches by the red glow of scattered fires and braziers. There were Trollocs everywhere, great man-like shapes, their all-too-human faces distorted by bestial muzzles and snouts and beaks, sporting horns or tusks or feathered crests. Those in the distance appeared more indistinct than the nearest, only half-formed, while the nearest were giants twice as tall as a man, even larger than any Trolloc, all clad in leather and black-spiked mail, howling and capering around cook-fires and cauldrons, racks and strange spiked frames and metal shapes. It really was a nightmare, though larger than any Elaine had heard of from Egwene or the Wise Ones. Once freed of the mind that created them, such things sometimes drifted through the world of dreams and sometimes latched onto a particular spot. Aiel dreamwalkers destroyed each as a matter of course whenever they found one, but they, and Egwene, had told her the best thing to do was avoid any she saw altogether. Unfortunately, Carlinia apparently had not listened when she and Nynaeve passed that on. The White Sister was bound and hanging by her ankles from a chain that disappeared into darkness overhead. To Elaine's eyes, the glow of Saidar still surrounded her, but Carlinia writhed frantically and screamed as she was slowly lowered head first toward a great, bubbling, black kettle of boiling oil. Even as Elaine ran into the corridor, Anaya and Morvrin halted at the border where hallway abruptly became cavern. For all of a heartbeat they halted. Then suddenly their hazy forms seemed to elongate toward the boundary, like smoke drawn into a chimney. No sooner had they touched it than they were inside, Morvrin shouting as two Trollocs turned great iron wheels that stretched her tighter and tighter, Anaya dangling by her wrists as Trollocs danced about her, flogging her with metal-tipped whips that tore long rents in her dress.
I'll be right back.
"We must link," Shiriam said, and the glow surrounding her merged with that around Mirella and Baonin. Even so, it did not come near the brightness of that around a single woman in the waking world, a woman who was not a misty dream. "No," Elaine shouted urgently. "You mustn't accept it as real. You must treat it as—" She seized Shiriam's arm, but the flow of fire the three had woven, tenuous even with them linked, touched the dividing line between dream and nightmare. The weave vanished there as if the nightmare had absorbed it, and in the same instant the three Aes Sedai became drawn out, mist caught in a wind. They had time only for startled yells before they touched the boundary and vanished. Shiriam reappeared inside, her head sticking up from a dark metal bell shape. Trollocs turned handles and jerked levers on the outside, and Shiriam's red hair flailed wildly as she shrieked in rising crescendos. Of the other two there was no sign, but Elaine thought she could hear more screaming in the distance, someone wailing, "No!" over and over, another shrieking for help. "Do you remember what we told you about dispelling nightmares?" Elaine asked. Eyes fixed on the scene in front of her, Swan nodded. "Deny its reality. Try to fix things in your mind as they would be without it." That had been Shiriam's mistake, all the Aes Sedai's mistake, probably. By trying to channel against the nightmare, they had accepted it as real, and that acceptance had pulled them into it as surely as walking in, leaving them helpless unless they remembered what they had forgotten, which they showed no signs of doing. The climbing shrieks audibled into Elaine's ears. "The corridor," she muttered, trying to form in her head how it had been when she saw it last. "Think of the corridor the way you remember it." "I'm trying, girl," Swan growled. "It isn't working." Elaine sighed. Swan was right. Not a line of the scene before them so much as wavered. Shiriam's head was almost vibrating above the metal shroud that enclosed the rest of her. Morvran's howls came in strained pants. Elaine almost thought she could hear the woman's joints being pulled apart. Carlinia's hair, hanging below her, was almost touching the roiling surface of the hot oil. Two women were not enough. The nightmare was too big. "We need the others," she said. "Liana and Nynaeve? Girl, if we knew where to find them, Shiriam and the rest would be dead before—" She trailed off, staring at Elaine. "You don't mean Liana and Nynaeve, do you? You mean Shiriam and—" Elaine only nodded. She was too frightened to speak. "I don't think they can hear us from here, or see us. Those Trollocs haven't even glanced our way. That means we have to try from inside." Elaine nodded again. "Girl," Swan said in a toneless voice, "you have a lion's courage and maybe a fisherbird's sense." With a heavy sigh, she added, "But I don't see any other way myself." Elaine agreed with her about everything except the courage. If she had not had her knees locked, she would have been in a heap on the floor tiles, patterned in all the colors of the Ajas. She realized she had a sword in her hand, a great gleaming length of steel, absolutely useless, even had she known how to wield it. She let it fall, and it vanished before reaching the floor. "Waiting isn't helping anything," she muttered. Much longer, and the little courage she had managed to scrape together would surely evaporate. Together, she and Swan stepped toward the boundary. Elaine's foot touched that dividing line, and suddenly she felt herself being pulled in, sucked like water through a tube. One instant she was standing in the hallway staring at the horrors. The next she was lying on her belly on rough gray stone, wrists and ankles tightly tied in the small of her back, and the horrors were all around her. The caverns stretched endless in every direction. The tower corridor no longer seemed to exist. Screams filled the air, echoing from rocky walls and a ceiling dripping stalactites. A few paces from her, a huge black cauldron stood steaming over a roaring fire. A boar-snouted Trolloc, complete with tusks, was tossing in lumps that seemed to be unidentifiable roots. A cookpot. Trollocs ate everything, including people. She thought of her hands and feet free, but the coarse rope still dug into her flesh. Even the pale shadow of Saidar had vanished. The true source no longer existed for her, not here. A nightmare in truth, and she was well and truly caught. Swan's voice cut through the screams in a pained moan. "Shiriam! Listen to me! The light alone knew what was being done to her. Elaine could not see any of the others, only hear them. This is a dream. Ah! Ah! Think how it should be. Elaine took it up. Shiriam, Anaya, everybody, listen to me. You must think of the corridor as it was, as it really is. This is only real as long as you believe it. She set the image of the corridor in her head firmly, colored tiles in ordered rows and gilded stand lamps and brilliant woven tapestries. Nothing changed. The screams still echoed. You must think of the corridor. Hold it in your minds, and it will be real. You can defeat this if you try. The Trolloc looked at her. It had a thick, sharp-pointed knife in its hand now. Shiriam, Anaya, you have to concentrate. Mirella, Bayonin, concentrate on the corridor. The Trolloc heaved her onto her side. She tried to wriggle away, but a massive knee held her in place effortlessly, while the thing began slicing at her clothes like a hunter skinning a deer carcass. Desperately, she held on to the image of the hallway. Carlinia, Morvrin, for the love of the light, concentrate. Think of the corridor, all of you. Think of it hard. Grunting something in a harsh language never meant for a human tongue, the Trolloc flipped her face down again and knelt on her thick knees, crushing her arms against her back. The corridor! She screamed. It tangled heavy fingers in her hair, yanked her head back. The corridor! Think of the corridor! The Trolloc's blade touched her tight-stretched neck beneath her left ear. The corridor! The corridor! The blade began to slide. Suddenly she was staring at colored floor tiles under her nose. Clapping hands to her throat, marveling that they were free to move, she felt wetness and brought her fingers up to stare at them. Blood, but only a tiny smear. A shudder rippled through her. If that Trolloc had succeeded in cutting her throat, no healing could have cured that. Shuddering again, she pushed slowly to her feet. It was the tower hallway outside the Amerlin's study, with no sign of Trollocs or caverns. Swan was there, looking a mass of bruises in a torn dress, and the eyes Sedai, misty forms of near ruin. Carlinia was in the best shape, and she stood wide-eyed and shaking, fingering dark hair that now ended frizzily a hand from her scalp. Shiriam and Anaya seemed to be weeping heaps of bloody rags. Mirella huddled in on herself, white-faced, naked, and covered with long red scratches and welts. Morvrin moaned every time she moved, and she moved unnaturally, as though her joints did not work properly anymore. Bayonin's dress appeared to have been clawed to shreds, and she was panting on her knees, more wide-eyed than ever, holding onto the wall to keep from falling over. Abruptly, Elaine realized that her own dress and shift were hanging from her shoulders, neatly sliced open down the front. A hunter skinning a deer carcass. She shivered so hard she almost fell. Repairing the garments was a simple matter of thought, but she was not sure how long it would take to repair her memories. We must go back, Morvrin said, kneeling awkwardly between Shiriam and Anaya. Despite her stiffness and groans, she sounded as stolid as ever. There is healing to be done, and none here can manage it as we are. Yes. Carlinia touched her short hair again. Yes, it might be best if we returned to Salidar. Her voice was a decidedly unsteady version of its normal iciness. I will stay a little while, if no one objects, Swan told them, or rather suggested, in that ill-fitting, humble voice. Her dress was whole again, but the bruises remained. I might learn a little more that's useful. All that's wrong with me are a few lumps, and I've had worse falling in a boat. You look more as if someone had dropped a boat on you, Morvrin told her. But the choice is yours. I will stay too, Elaine said. I can help Swan, and I wasn't hurt at all. She was aware of the nick on her throat every time she swallowed. I don't need any help, Swan said, at the same moment that Morvrin said in an even firmer tone, You kept your head very well tonight, child. Don't spoil it now. You're coming with us. Elaine nodded grumpily. Arguing would get her nowhere except into hot water. You would have thought the Brown sister was the teacher here, and Elaine the pupil. They probably thought she had stumbled into the nightmare the same way they did. Remember, you can step out of the dream straight into your own body. You do not have to go back to Salidar first. There was no way of telling whether they heard her. Morvran had turned away as soon as she nodded. Be easy, Shiriam, the stout woman said soothingly. We will be back in Salidar in a few moments. Be easy, Anaya. Shiriam at least had stopped crying, though she still moaned in pain. Carlinia, will you help Mirella? Are you ready, Baronin? Baronin. The Grey raised her head and stared at Morvran a moment before nodding. The Six Eyes Sedai vanished. With a last glance at Swan, Elaine was only a moment behind, but she did not go to Salidar. Someone would very likely be coming to heal the scrape on her neck, if they had noticed it, but for a little while they would be concerned with Six Eyes Sedai, who would wait looking as if they had been pushed through some monstrous clockworks. Elaine had those few minutes and another destination in mind. The grand hall in her mother's palace in Camelin did not appear around her with any ease. There was a feel of resistance before she stood on a red and white tiled floor beneath the great arched roof, between rows of massive white columns. Once more, light seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere. The huge windows overhead, depicting the white lion of Andor, alternating with the earliest queens of the realm and scenes of great Andoran victories, were indistinct with the night outside. Immediately she saw the difference from what she knew that had made coming here difficult. On the dais at the end of the hall where the lion throne should have stood was instead a grandiose monstrosity made of dragons sparkling gold and red in gilt and enamel, with sunstones for their eyes. Her mother's throne had not been removed from the chamber. It stood on a kind of pedestal behind and above the monstrous thing. Elaine walked slowly down the hall and climbed the white marble stairs to stare up at the gilded throne of Andoran queens. The white lion of Andor, picked out in moonstones against a field of rubies on the back, would have stood above her mother's head. "What are you doing, Randall Thor?" she whispered harshly. "What do you think you are doing?" She was terribly afraid that he was bungling matters without her there to guide him between the pitfalls. True, he had handled the Tyrans well enough, and apparently the Kyrianen, but her people were different, bluff and straightforward, with a dislike of being maneuvered or bullied. What had worked in Tyr or Kyrian could blow up in his face like an illuminator's display of fireworks. If only she could be with him. If only she could warn him about the Tower's embassy. Elida had to have some trick hidden to spring when he least expected it. Would he be sensible enough to see it? For that matter, she had no idea what the Salidar embassy's orders were. Despite Swan's efforts, most Aes Sedai in Salidar still seemed of two minds about Randall Thor. He was the dragon reborn, prophesied savior of humanity, but then again he was a man who could channel, doomed to madness, death, and destruction. Take care of him, Min, she thought. Reach him quickly and take care of him. A stab of jealousy hit her that Min would be there to do what she wanted to. She might have to share him, but she would have part of him all to herself. She would bond him as her warder, whatever it took. It will be done. She stretched a hand up toward the lion throne to swear as queens had sworn since there was an Andor. The pedestal was too high for her to reach, but the intent should count. It will be done. Time was running out. And Aes Sedai would be coming back in Salidar to wake her and heal the pitiful scratch on her neck. With a sigh, she stepped out of the dream. Dimondred moved out from behind the columns of the grand hall and looked from the two thrones to where the girl had vanished. Elaine tracanned, unless he missed his guess wildly, and using a minor terangreal by the faint look of her, one made for training beginning students. He would have given much to know what was in her head, but her words and expression had been plain enough. She did not like what Althor was doing here, not in the least, and meant to do something about it. A determined young woman, he suspected. In any case, another thread in the tangle yanked, however feeble the pull turned out to be. Let the Lord of Chaos rule, he told the thrones, though he still wished he knew why it had to be so, and opened a gateway to leave Tel'aran'rhiod. Chapter 8. The storm gathers. Nynaeve woke the next morning at first light feeling grumpy. She had a sense of bad weather coming, yet a glance out of the window revealed not a single cloud marring the still gray sky. Already the day promised to be another oven. Her shift was sweat-damp and twisted from tossing and turning. Once she had been able to rely on her ability to listen to the wind, but it seemed to have gone all askew since leaving the 2 rivers, when it did not desert her completely. Waiting her turn to use the washstand did not help either, nor listening to Elaine's recital of what had happened after she left them in Elida's study. Her own night had been one long, futile search through the streets of Tarvalin, empty save herself, pigeons, rats, and heaps of garbage. That had been a shock. Tarvalin was always kept spotless. Elida must be neglecting the city terribly for garbage to show in Tel Riod. Once she had glimpsed Liana through the window of a tavern near South Harbor, but when she hurried inside, the common room was empty except for the freshly painted blue tables and benches. She should just have given up, but Mirella had been badgering her lately, and she had a clear conscience when she told the woman to hide. Mirella could pounce on an evasion as quickly as anyone Nynaeve had ever seen or heard of. To finish it off, she had stepped out of Tel Riod last night to find Elaine's ring already back on the table, and Elaine fast asleep. If there had been a prize for useless effort, she would have won it walking away. And now to learn that Shiriam and the rest had nearly gotten themselves killed. Even the song sparrow's chirping in its wicker cage earned a sour look. "They think they know everything," Nynaeve muttered disparagingly. "I told them about nightmares. I warned them, and last night was not the first time." It made no difference that all 6 sisters had been healed before she so much as got back from Tel Riod. Much too easily it could have ended much worse, because they thought they knew it all. The irritated tugs she gave her braid delayed redoing it for the day. The Idam bracelet sometimes caught on her hair, too, but she was not about to take it off. It was Elaine's turn to wear it today, but she was just as likely to leave it on a peg on the wall. Worry tickled through the bracelet, and the inevitable fear, but more than anything else, frustration. Doubtless Marigan was already helping with breakfast. Having to do chores seemed to grate at her more than being a prisoner did. "That was good thinking on your part, Elaine. You didn't say how you ended up in it yourself after trying to warn everybody else." Still scrubbing with her face cloth, Elaine shuddered. It wasn't so hard to think of it. A nightmare that size needed all of us to handle. Maybe they learned a little humility. Maybe their meeting with the wise ones tonight won't be so bad. Nynaeve nodded to herself, as she had thought. Not about Shiriam and the others. Aes Sedai would find humility when goats flew on wings, and a day before the wise ones at that. About Elaine. She had probably let herself be caught in the nightmare, though the girl would never admit it. Nynaeve was not sure whether Elaine thought taking credit for bravery was boasting, or whether she simply did not realize how brave she was. Either way, she was torn between admiration for the other woman's courage and a wish that just once Elaine would acknowledge it. "I thought I saw Rand." That brought the face cloth down. Was he there in the flesh? That was dangerous, according to the wise ones. It risked losing some part of what made you human. "You warned him about that?" "When did he start listening to sense? I only glimpsed him. Maybe he just touched Tel Riod in a dream. Unlikely that. He apparently hedged his dreams with wards so strong she did not think he could reach the world of dreams any other way than in the flesh, not even if he had been a dream walker and had one of the rings. Maybe it was somebody who looked a little like him. As I said, I only saw him for a moment, in the square in front of the tower." "I should be there with him," Elaine muttered. Emptying the basin into the nightjar, she moved aside to let Nynaeve reach the washstand. "He needs me." "What he needs is what he has always needed," Nynaeve glowered as she refilled the basin from the pitcher. She did hate washing in water that had stood all night. At least it was not cold. There was no such thing as cold water anymore. Somebody to box his ears once a week on general principles and keep him on the straight and narrow. It isn't fair. A clean shift going over Elaine's head muffled the words. I worry about him all the time. Her face popped out the top, looking more worried than indignant, whatever her tone, and she pulled a banded white dress from one of the pegs. I even worry about him in my dreams. Do you think he spends all his time fretting about me? I don't. Nynaeve nodded, though a part of her considered that it was not exactly the same. Rand had been told Elaine was safe with Aes Sedai, if not where. How could Rand ever be safe? She bent over the basin, and Lan's ring fell out of her shift, dangling on its leather cord. No, Elaine was right. Whatever Lan was doing, wherever he was, she doubted he thought of her half as often as she did of him. Light, let him be alive, even if he doesn't think of me at all. That possibility made her angry enough to pull her braid out by the roots, if she had not had her hands full of soap and face-cloth. You can't concern yourself over a man all the time, she said sourly, even if you do want to be a green. What did they find out last night? It was a long tale, though with little meat to it, and after a bit Nynaeve sat down on Elaine's bed to listen and ask questions. Not that the answers told her much either. It was just not the same when you did not see the documents yourself. All very well to learn Elida finally knew about Rand's amnesty, but what did she mean to do about it? Proof the tower was approaching rulers might actually be good news. It might light a fire under the hall. Something had to. Elida sending an embassy to Rand was certainly a worry. He could not be fool enough to listen to anyone who came from Elida. Could he? There just was not enough in what Elaine had overheard. And what was Rand doing, putting the Lion Throne on a pedestal? What was he doing with a throne at all? He might be the dragon reborn and this Aiel car whatever, but she could not get past the fact that she had tended him when he was a child and paddled his bottom when he needed it. Elaine went right ahead dressing and was done before her story was. I'll tell you the rest later, she said hastily, and flew out the door. Nynaeve grunted and went back to clothing herself unhurriedly. Elaine was teaching her first class of novices today, something Nynaeve had not been allowed to do yet. But if she was not trusted to teach novices, there was still Moghedien. She would be done with her breakfast chores shortly. The only trouble was, when Nynaeve found the woman, Moghedien was up to her elbows in soapy water, the silver necklace of the Idam looking especially out of place. She was not alone. A dozen other women were industriously scrubbing clothes on washboards in a wooden-fenced yard, amid steaming kettles of boiling water. More were hanging the first wash on long lines strung between poles, but heaps of bed linens and small clothes, and every sort of thing waited their turn on the washboards. The look Moghedien gave Nynaeve should have been enough to fry her hide. Hatred, shame, and outrage rolled through the Idam, nearly enough to swamp the ever-present fear. The woman in charge, a stick-like gray-haired woman named Nildra, came bustling up, a stirring paddle held like a scepter and her dark woolen skirts tied up to the knee to keep them off the ground muddy from spilled water. Good morning, accepted. I suppose you want Marigan, eh? Her tone was a dry blend of respect, with knowledge that tomorrow she might find any one of the accepted added to her laundresses for a day or a month, to be worked and chivied as hard as the rest, if not harder. Well, I can't let her go yet. I'm short-handed as it is. One of my girls is getting married today, another ran off, and two are on light work because they're pregnant. Mirella Sedai told me I could have her. Maybe I can do without her in a few hours. I'll see. Moghedien straightened, opening her mouth, but Nynaeve silenced her with a firm look and a conspicuous touch to the Idam bracelet on her wrist, and she resumed work. All it would take would be a few wrong words from Moghedien, a complaint that would never come from the farm woman she appeared to be, to start her on a path to Stilling and the headsman, and Nynaeve and Elaine on one not much better. Nynaeve could not help swallowing in relief when Moghedien bent back to her washboard, mouth working as she muttered under her breath. Immense shame and outright fury surged through the Idam. Nynaeve managed to smile for Nildra and murmured something, she was not sure what, then stalked off to the communal kitchens to find breakfast. Mirella again. She wondered if the green had taken against her personally for some reason. She wondered if she was going to harvest a permanently sour stomach from keeping Muggedian. She was practically eating goosemint like candy since putting the Idam on the woman. It was easy enough to get a clay mug full of tea with honey and a bun hot from the oven, but once she had them, she walked while she ate. Sweat beaded on her face. Even at that early hour, heat was building and the air dry. The rising sun formed a dome of molten gold above the forest. The dirt streets were full, as usual when there was light to see. Aes Sedai glided past serenely, ignoring dust and heat, mysterious-faced on mysterious errands, often with warders healing them, cold-eyed wolves vainly pretending to be tame. There were soldiers everywhere, usually marching or riding in blocks, though Nynaeve did not understand why they were allowed to crowd the streets so when they had camps in the woods. Children darted about, often aping the soldiers with sticks for swords and pikes. White-clad novices trotted through the throng about their chores. Servants moved somewhat more slowly, women with armloads of sheets for Aes Sedai's beds, or baskets of bread from the kitchens. Men leading ox carts piled with firewood, hauling chests or shouldering whole sheep carcasses for the kitchens. Salidar had not been made to hold so many people. The village was ready to pop at the seams. Nynaeve kept moving. An acceptance day was supposedly her own for the most part, unless she was teaching novices, to be used studying what she chose to, alone or with an Aes Sedai. But an accepted who appeared to be doing nothing could be snapped up by any Aes Sedai. She did not intend to spend the day helping a brown sister catalog books or copying out notes for a gray. She hated copying, with all that tongue-clicking if she made a blot, and all those sighs because her script was not as neat as a clerk's. So she wove through the dust and the crowd, and kept an eye out for Swan and Liana. She was angry enough to channel without using Moghedian. Every time she became aware of the heavy gold ring nestling between her breasts, she thought, he has to be alive. Even if he's forgotten me, Light, just let him be alive. Which last, of course, only made her angrier. If Al Lan ran Dragger so much as let forgetting her cross his mind, she would set him straight. He had to be alive. Warders often died avenging their Aes Sedai. It was as sure as the sun coming up that no warder would let anything stand in the way of that retribution. But there was no way for Lan to avenge Moiraine any more than if she had fallen off a horse and broken her neck. She and Lanfear had killed one another. He had to be alive. And why should she feel guilty over Moiraine's death? True, it had freed Lan for her, but she had had nothing to do with it. Yet her first thought on learning Moiraine was dead, however momentary, had been joy that Lan was free, not sorrow for Moiraine. She could not rid herself of shame over that, and it made her angrier than ever. Suddenly she saw Mirella stalking down the street in her direction with yellow-haired Croy Makin, one of her 3 warders, striding at her side, a young splinter of a man, but hard as rock. A determined look on her face, the Aes Sedai certainly showed no effects from the night before. There was nothing to say Mirella was looking for her, but Nynaeve quickly ducked into a large stone building that had once been one of Salidar's 3 inns. The broad common room had been cleared and furnished like a reception room. Its plaster walls and high ceiling had been patched, a few bright tapestries had been hung, and a few colorful rugs lay scattered on a floor that no longer looked precisely splintered, but still did not want to hold a polish. The shaded interior actually seemed cool after the street. Cooler, at least. It was also in use. Logain stood insolently in front of one of the wide, unlit fireplaces, the tails of his gold-embroidered red coat shoved behind his back, under the watchful gaze of Lelaine Akashi, her blue-fringed shawl marking the occasion as formal. A slender woman with a dignified air that could sometimes break in a warm smile, she was one of the 3 sitters for the Blue Aja in the hall of the tower in Salidar. Today it was her penetrating eye most in evidence as she studied Logain's audience. 2 men and a woman resplendent in embroidered silks and gold jewelry, all 3 graying,
I'll
and
do
one of
that
the men nearly
later.
bald and wearing a square-cut beard and long mustache to make up for it. Powerful Altaran nobles, they had arrived the day before with strong escorts and as much suspicion for one another as for the Aes Sedai gathering an army inside Altara. Altarans gave allegiance to a lord or a lady or a town, with little if any left for a nation called Altara, and few nobles paid taxes, or heed to what the queen in Ebu Dar said, but they gave heed to an army in their midst. The
Hey.
light alone knew what effect the rumors of Dragonsworn had on them. For the moment, though, they forgot to stare haughtily at one another or defiantly at Lilane. Their eyes were fixed on Logain, as they might have been on a huge, brightly colored viper. To complete the cycle, copper-skinned Buren Sharon, looking carved from an uprooted stump, watched both Logain and the visitors, a man ready to move suddenly and violently in the blink of an eye. Lilane's warder was there only partly to guard Logain. Supposedly, Logain was in Salidar of his own free will, after all, and mainly to protect the man from his visitors and a knife in his heart.
Yeah, Ozzy
For
had
his
it.
part,
He threw up
Logain
a little
appeared to
bit.
flourish under all those stares. A tall man with curling hair that touched his broad shoulders, dark and handsome, if hard of face, he looked as proud and confident as an eagle. It was a promise of vengeance that put the light in his eyes, though. If he could not repay everyone he wanted to, he could at least repay some. 6 red sisters found me in Cosamela about a year before I proclaimed myself, he said as Nynaeve came in. Javindra, the leader, was called, though one named Barasine talked a good deal, and I heard Elida mentioned, as if she knew what these were about. They found me asleep, and I thought I was done when they shielded me. Aes Sedai, the listening woman broke in harshly. Stocky and hard-eyed, she had a thin scar across her cheek that Nynaeve found incongruous on a woman. Altaran women did have a reputation for fierceness, of course, though very likely overblown. Aes Sedai, how can what he claims be true? I do not know how, Lady Serena, Lilane said calmly, but it was confirmed to me by one who cannot lie. He speaks true. Serena's face did not change, but her hands clenched into fists behind her back. One of her companions, the tall, gaunt-faced man with more gray hair than black, had his thumbs tucked behind his sword belt, trying to appear at ease, but his grip was white-knuckled tight. As I was saying, Logain went on with a smooth smile, they found me and gave me a choice of death on the spot or taking what they offered. A strange choice, not at all what I expected, but not one I had to think long on. They did not come out and say they had done this before, but there was a practiced feel to it. They gave no reasons, but it seems clear looking back. Bringing in a man who could channel carried little glory. Pulling down a false dragon, though. Nynaeve frowned. He was so casual about it, a man discussing the day's hunting, yet it was his own downfall he spoke of, and every word another nail in Elida's coffin, maybe in a coffin for the whole Red Aja. If the Reds had pushed Logain to name himself the Dragon Reborn, could they have done the same for Gorin Rogad or Musrim Time? Perhaps for all the false dragons throughout history? She could all but see the thoughts turning in the Altarans' minds like gears in a mill, reluctantly at first, then spinning faster and faster. For a whole year they helped me avoid other Aes Sedai, Logain said. Sent messages when one was near, though there weren't many then. After I proclaimed myself and began to gather a following, they sent news of where the king's armies were and in what numbers. How else do you think I always knew where to strike and when? His listeners shifted their feet, as much for his feral grin as for his words. He hated Aes Sedai. Nynaeve was sure of that from the few times she had been able to bring herself to study him. Not that she had done so since before Min left, or learned anything when she had. Once she had thought studying him would be looking at the problem from a different angle. Never was just how different men were as clear as in using the power. But it was worse than staring into a dark hole. There was nothing there, not even the hole. All in all, being around Logain was unsettling. He had watched her every move with a burning intensity that made her shiver, even knowing she could wrap him up in the power if he so much as lifted a finger wrong. Not the sort of fervor that men's eyes often directed at women, but a pure contempt that never touched his face at all, which made it all the more horrifying. Aes Sedai had shut him away from the one power forever. Nynaeve could imagine her own feelings if anyone did that to her. He could not revenge himself on all Aes Sedai, however. What he could do was destroy the Red Ajah, and he was making a fair beginning to it. This was the first time 3 had come at once, but every week or so brought another lord or lady to hear his tale, from across Altara, and sometimes as far as Murandy, and everyone left looking squeezed flat by what Logain had to say. Small wonder. The only news more shocking would have been for the Aes Sedai to admit the Black Ajah really did exist. Well, they were not about to do that, not publicly, and for much the same reason they held news of Logain as close as possible. It might have been the Red Ajah who did this, but they were still Aes Sedai, and too many people could not tell one Ajah from another. All in all, only a few were brought to hear Logain, yet every one of that handful was chosen for the power of the house they led. Houses that now would lend their support to the Aes Sedai and Salidar, if not always openly, or at worst withhold support from Elida. Javindra sent me word when more Aes Sedai came, Logain said. The ones hunting me and where they would be, so I could come on them before they knew. Lelane's serene, ageless features hardened for a moment, and Buren's hand drifted toward his sword hilt. Sisters had died before Logain was captured. Logain did not seem to notice their reactions. The Red Ajah never played me false until they betrayed me in the end. The bearded man was staring at Logain so hard it was plain he was making himself do it. Aes Sedai, what of his followers? Perhaps he was safe in the tower, but he was captured a good many leagues closer to where we stand. They were not all killed or captured, the gaunt-faced lord put in right behind him. Most escaped, melted away. I know my history, Aes Sedai. Rowland Darksbane's followers dared attack the White Tower itself after he was taken, and Guer Amalison's as well. We remember too well Logain's army marching across our lands who wanted to come again to rescue him. You need have no fear of that. Lelaine eyed Logain with a brief smile, as a woman might a fierce dog she knew tamed to her leash. He has no more desire for glory, only to make some small restitution for the harm he did, besides which I doubt many of his former followers would come if he did call, not after he was carried to Tar Valon in a cage and gentled. Her light laugh was echoed by the Altarans, but only after a moment, and weakly. Logain's face was an iron mask. Abruptly, Lelaine noticed Nynaeve just inside the doorway, and her eyebrows rose. She had exchanged pleasant words with Nynaeve more than once, and praised her and Elaine's supposed victories, but she could be as quick as any other Aes Sedai to call down and accept it who put a foot wrong. Nynaeve dropped a curtsy, gesturing with the clay mug, now empty of tea. Pardon me, Lelaine Sedai, I must take this back to the kitchen. She darted out into the baking street before the Aes Sedai could say a word. Luckily, Mirella was nowhere in sight now. Nynaeve was in no mood for yet another lecture on showing responsibility or holding her temper, or any one of a dozen fool things. An even better piece of luck, Swan was standing not 30 paces away, facing Gareth Bryn in the middle of the street with the passing throng parting around them. Like Mirella, Swan showed no sign of the battering Elaine had reported. Perhaps they would have more respect for Telairan Riod if they could not simply step out and have their blunders healed. Nynaeve moved closer. What is the matter with you, woman? Bryn growled at Swan. His gray head lowered over her youthful-seeming one. Booted feet planted wide and fists on hips made him seem as wide as a boulder. The sweat rolling down his face might have been on someone else's for all the mind he paid it. I compliment you on how soft my shirts are, and you snap my head off. And I said you looked cheerful. Hardly the opening of a battle, I thought. It was a compliment, woman. if not one with roses in it. Compliments, Swan growled right back, blue eyes blazing up at him. I don't want your compliments. It just pleases you that I have to iron your shirts. You are a smaller man than I ever thought, Gareth Bryn. Do you expect me to trail after you like a camp follower when the army marches, hoping for more of your compliments? And you will not address me so, as woman. It sounds like here, dog. A vein started throbbing on Bryn's temple. It pleases me that you keep your word, Swan. And if the army ever does march, I expect you to continue keeping it. I never asked that oath of you. It was your own choice to try wriggling out of responsibility for what you did. You never thought you'd be called to keep it, did you? Speaking of the army marching, what have you heard while groveling for the Aes Sedai and kissing their feet? In one heartbeat, Swan went from fiery rage to icy calm. That is no part of my oath. You might have thought her a young Aes Sedai, standing there straight-backed with that coolly arrogant defiance, one who had not worked with the power long enough to take on agelessness. I will not spy for you. You serve the Hall of the Tower, Gareth Bryn, on your oath. Your army will march when the Hall decides. Listen for their words and obey when you hear. The change in Bryn was as lightning quick. You would be an enemy worth crossing swords with, he chuckled admiringly. You would be a better. That fast, the chuckle faded back into a glower. The Hall, is it? Bah! You tell Shiriam she might as well stop avoiding me. What can be done here has been done. Tell her a wolfhound kept in a cage might as well be a pig when the wolves come. I didn't gather these men to be sold at market. With a short nod, he went striding off through the crowd. Swan stared after him, frowning. What was all that about? Nynaeve asked, and Swan gave a start. None of your business is what it was, she snapped, smoothing her dress. You would have thought Nynaeve had sneaked up on her purposely. The woman always took everything personally. Let it pass, Nynaeve said levelly. She was not going to let herself be led off down a side trail. What I won't let pass is studying you. She was going to do something useful today if it killed her. Swan opened her mouth, looking at her. No, I don't have Marigan, and right now I don't need her. You've let me near you twice, since I found a clue that something in you might be healed. I mean to study you today, and if I don't, I will tell Shiriam you're disobeying her orders to make yourself available. I swear I will. For a moment she thought the other woman was going to dare her to do her worst, but at last Swan said grudgingly, This afternoon. I'm busy this morning, unless you think what you want is more important than helping your Two Rivers friend. Nynaeve stepped closer. No one in the street was paying them any mind beyond a glance in passing, but she lowered her voice anyway. What are they planning about him? You keep saying they haven't made up their minds what to do, but they must have come to some conclusion by now. If they had, Swan would know of it, whether she was supposed to or not. Abruptly, Lyanna was there, and Nynaeve might as well not have spoken. Swan and Lyanna glared at one another, stiff-backed as two strange cats in a small room. Well, Swan muttered with a tight jaw. Lyanna sniffed, and her curls swung as she tossed her head. A sneer twisted her lips, yet her words did not match expression or tone. I tried to talk them out of it, she spat, but softly. Only they had not listened to you enough to even consider it. You won't be meeting the wise ones tonight. Fish guts, Swan growled, and turning on her heel, she stalked away, but no more quickly than Lyanna in the opposite direction. Nynaeve almost threw up her hands in frustration, talking as if she were not there, as if she did not know exactly what they were talking about, ignoring her. Swan had better appear this afternoon as promised, or she would find a way to wring her out and hang her up to dry. She jumped as a woman spoke behind her. Those two should be sent to Tiara for a sound switching. Lelaine stepped up beside Nynaeve, looking first after Swan, then Lyanna. Going around, sneaking up on people. There was no sign of Logain or Buren or the Altaran nobles. The Blue Sister shifted her shawl. They are not what they were, of course, but one would think they could retain a little decorum. It will not do if they actually come to hair-pulling in the street. Sometimes people just rub one another the wrong way, Nynaeve said. Swan and Lyanna worked so hard to maintain their fiction, the least she could do was support it. How she hated people sneaking up on her. Lyanna eyed Nynaeve's hand on her braid, and she snatched it away. Too many knew about that habit, a habit she had tried hard to break. But what the Aes Sedai said was, "Not when it impinges on the dignity of Aes Sedai, child. Women who serve Aes Sedai should show some reserve in public, however silly they are in private." There was certainly nothing to be said to that. Nothing safe, anyway. "Why did you come in where I was showing Logain just now?" "I thought the room was empty, Aes Sedai," Nynaeve said hastily. "I'm sorry. I hope I did not disturb you." That was no answer. She could hardly say she'd been hiding from Mirella, but the slender blue only met her eyes for a moment. "What do you think Rand al'Thor will do, child?" Nynaeve blinked in confusion. "Aes Sedai, I haven't seen him in half a year. All I know is what I've heard here. Is the Hall... Aes Sedai, what has the Hall decided about him?" Scrutinizing Nynaeve's face, Lelaine pursed her lips. Those dark eyes, seeming to see inside your head, were quite unsettling. "A remarkable coincidence. You come from the same village as the Dragon Reborn, and so does that other girl, Egwene al'Vir. Great things were expected when she became a novice. Do you have any idea where she is?" She did not wait for an answer. "And the other two young men, Perrine Barra and Matt Coffin, both Taviran as well, so I understand. Remarkable indeed. Then there is you, with your extraordinary discoveries despite your limitations. Wherever Egwene is, does she also venture where none of us have gone? All of you have occasioned a good deal of discussion among the sisters, as you may imagine." "I hope they say good things," Nynaeve said slowly. There had been many questions about Rand since coming to Salidar, especially since the embassy left for Caemlyn. Some Aes Sedai seemed able to speak of little else to her, but this seemed something different. That was the trouble with talking to Aes Sedai. Half the time you could not be sure what they meant or what they were after. "Do you still have hopes of healing Swan and Lyanna, child?" Nodding as if Nynaeve had answered, Lelaine sighed. "Sometimes I think Mirella is right. We indulge you too much. Whatever your discoveries, perhaps we should put you in Theodrin's charge until your block against channeling at will is broken. Considering what you have done in the last 2 months, think what you could do then." Gripping her braid unconsciously, Nynaeve tried to get a word in edgewise, a carefully framed protest, but Lelaine ignored the attempt, which was probably for the best. "You do Swan and Lyanna no favors, child. Let them forget who and what they were and be content with who and what they are. From the way they behave, the only thing that keeps them from forgetting completely is you and your foolish attempts to heal what cannot be healed. They are no longer Aes Sedai. Why hold out false hope?" There was a hint of compassion in her voice, and a tinge of contempt, too. Those not Aes Sedai were less, after all, and Swan and Lyanna's ruse had definitely painted them among the least. Plus, of course, no few here in Salidar blamed the Tower's troubles on Swan, on her plotting while Amyrlin. Very likely they believed she deserved everything that had happened to her, and more. What had been done complicated the whole thing, though. Stilling was rare. Before Swan and Lyanna, no woman had been tried and stilled in 140 years, and none burned out in at least a dozen. A stilled woman usually tried to get as far from Aes Sedai as she could. No doubt if Lelaine had been stilled, she would want to forget being Aes Sedai if she could. No doubt she would like to forget that Swan and Lyanna had been too, that all that had been taken away from them. If they could be seen as two women never able to channel, never Aes Sedai, a good many Aes Sedai would be more comfortable. "Shiriam Sedai has given me permission to try," Nynaeve said, as firmly as she dared to a full sister. Lelaine held her eyes until she let her gaze drop. Her knuckles whitened around her braid before she could let go, but she kept her face smooth. Trying to trade stares with an Aes Sedai was a woolhead's trick, Foreign accepted. We are all fools sometimes, child, yet a wise woman learns to limit how often. Since you seem to have finished breakfast, I suggest you rid yourself of that mug and find something to do before you find yourself in hot water instead. Have you ever considered cutting your hair short? No matter. Off with you. Nynaeve dropped a curtsy, but it was being made to the Aes Sedai's back before she reached the bottom of it. Safe from Lelane's eyes, she glowered at the woman. Cut her hair? She lifted her braid and shook it at the retreating Aes Sedai. That she had waited until it was safe made her furious, though if she had not waited, she would almost certainly be on her way to join Moghedien at the laundry, with a stop to see Tiana on the way. Months sitting here in Salidar doing nothing. For all practical purposes, it seemed she was, no matter what she and Elaine managed to pull out of Moghedien. Amid Aes Sedai who did nothing except talk and wait, while the world went on its way to ruin without them, and Lelaine thought she should cut her hair. She had pursued the Black Adja, been captured and escaped, captured one of the Forsaken in turn. Well, none of them knew that. Helped the Panarch of Tarabon regain her throne, however briefly, and now all she did was sit and take credit for what she could shake loose from Moghedien. Cut her hair? She might as well shave herself bald for all the good it would do. She caught sight of Dagdara Finchi striding through the throng, as wide as any man in the street and taller than most, and the round-faced yellow made her angry too. One reason she had chosen to remain in Salidar was to study with the yellows, for they knew more of healing than anyone else. Everyone said so. But if any of them knew more than she already did, they were not sharing it with Amir accepted. The yellows should have been the most welcoming to her desire to heal anything and everything, even stilling, but they were the least. Dagdara would have had her scrubbing floors from sunup to sundown until she gave up foolish notions and wasting time, if Shiriam had not intervened, while Nisao Dachen, a diminutive yellow with eyes that could drive nails, refused to even speak to Nynaeve as long as she persisted in trying to alter how the pattern has been woven. To top it all off, her weather sense still told her a storm was on its way, closer now, while the cloudless sky and burning sun taunted her. Muttering to herself, she tucked the clay mug into the back of a passing woodcart and set off weaving through the crowded street. There was nothing to do except keep moving until Moghedien was free, and the light knew how long that would be. A whole morning wasted, added to a string of wasted days. Many of the Aes Sedai nodded and smiled at her, but by the simple expedient of smiling back apologetically and quickening her step for a few paces, as if hurrying somewhere, she avoided stopping for the inevitable questions about what new things they might expect out of her. In her present mood, she might just tell them exactly what she thought, which would be foolish in the extreme. Doing nothing, asking her what Rand was going to do, telling her to cut her hair. Bah! Of course, they were not all smiles. Not only did Nisao look right through Nynaeve, Nynaeve had to step nimbly out of the way before the tiny woman walked right over her. And the haughty, pale-haired Aes Sedai with a prominent chin, guiding a tall roan gelding through the crowd, cast a sharp blue-eyed frown at her as she rode by. Nynaeve did not recognize her. The woman was perfectly neat in a riding dress of pale gray silk, but the light linen dust cloak folded in front of her saddle spoke of travel and named her a new arrival. Adding to the likelihood that she was new come, the lanky green-coated warder at her heels on a tall gray warhorse looked uneasy. Warders never looked uneasy, but Nynaeve supposed joining a rebellion against the tower might make for an exception. Light! Even new arrivals came ready to put her back up. And then there was scar-faced Uno, his head shaven except for a topknot, and his missing eye covered by a patch, painted with a hideous glaring red replacement. Pausing in the leather-lunged flaying of an abashed young man in plaited mail armor, who stood holding the reins of a horse with a lance lashed to the saddle, Uno directed a warm grin in Nynaeve's direction. Well, it would have been warm without the eye patch. Nynaeve's grimace made him blink and hurry back to dressing down the soldier. It was not Uno or his eye patch that soured her stomach. Not exactly. He had accompanied her and Elaine to Salidar, and once promised to steal horses. Borrow, he called it, if they wanted to leave. No chance of that now. Uno wore a band of golden braid on the cuffs of his worn dark coat now. He was an officer, training heavy cavalry for Gareth Bryn, and much too caught up in it to bother himself with Nynaeve. No, that was not true. If she said she wanted to go, he would procure horses in a matter of hours, and she would ride with an escort of top-knotted Shinarans who had given their allegiance to Rand, and were only in Salidar because she and Elaine brought them there. Only she would have to admit she'd been wrong in deciding to stay, admit she'd been lying all those times she had told him she was happy right where she was. Making those admissions was just beyond her. Uno's main reason for staying was that he thought he should look after her and Elaine. He would hear no admissions from her. The whole thought of leaving Salidar was a new one, sparked by Uno, and it set her thinking fiercely. If only Tom and Julian had not gone jaunting off to Amadisia. Not that they had made the trip for the fun of it, really. Back in the days when it seemed the Aes Sedai here might really do something, they had volunteered to scout out what was going on across the river. Meaning to penetrate as far as Amador itself, they had been gone well over a month, and would not return for days more at best. They were not the only scouts, of course. Even Aes Sedai and warders had been sent, though most of those were aimed farther west, at Tarabon. A show of doing something, and the delay before any could return with word was a good excuse to wait. Nynaeve wished she had not let the two men go. Neither would have, had she said no. Tom was an old glee man, though he had once been considerably more, and Julian a thief-taker from Tyr, both competent men who knew how to handle themselves in strange places, and handy in a number of ways. They had accompanied her and Elaine to Salidar too, and neither would have asked questions if told she wanted to leave. Undoubtedly they would have said a good deal behind her back, but not to her face, the way Uno would. It was galling to admit that she really needed them, but she was not sure she knew how to go about stealing a horse. In any case, an accepted would be noticed fooling around the horses, in the stables as much as out on the soldiers' picket lines, and if she changed out of the banded white dress, she would certainly be seen and reported before she got anywhere near a horse. Even if she managed it, she would be pursued. Runaway accepted, like runaway novices, were almost always brought back to face punishment that erased any thought of a second attempt. When you began training to be Aes Sedai were not finished with you until they said they were. It was not fear of punishment that held her, of course. What was a switching or two against the chance of being killed by the Black Aja or facing one of the Forsaken? It was just a matter of whether she really wanted to go. Where would she go, for instance? To Rand in Caemlyn? Egwene in Cairhien? Would Elaine come? Certainly if they went to Caemlyn. Was it a desire to do something, or fear that Moghedien was going to be discovered? The punishment for running away would not be a patch on that. She had reached no conclusion when she rounded a corner and found herself looking at Elaine's novice class, gathered in an open space between two thatch-roofed stone houses, where the fallen-in ruins of a third had been cleared away. More than 20 white-clad women sat on low stools in a semicircle, watching Elaine guide two of their number through an exercise. The glow of Saidar surrounded all three women. Tabaya, a green-eyed, freckle-faced girl of 16 or so, and Nicola, a slender, black-haired woman Nynaeve's age, were unsteadily passing a small flame back and forth. It wavered and sometimes vanished for an instant when one was too slow to catch it up from the other and maintain it. In her present mood, Nynaeve could clearly see the flows they wove. 18 novices had been whisked away when Sheriam and the rest fled. Tabaya was one of those, but most in this group were like Nicola, newly recruited since the Aes Sedai established themselves in Salidar. Nicola was not the only woman there older than usual for a novice. A good half were. When Nynaeve and Elaine went to the tower, Aes Sedai rarely tested women much older than Tabaya. Nynaeve had been remarked for her age as much as for being a wilder, but perhaps in desperation, the Aes Sedai here had expanded their testing to women even a year or two beyond Nynaeve. The result was that Salidar now held more novices than the White Tower had for years. That success had made the Aes Sedai send sisters out across Altara in a village-by-village search. "Do you wish you were teaching that class?" The voice at her shoulder made Nynaeve's stomach turn over. Twice in one morning. She wished she had some goose mint in her belt pouch. If she kept letting herself be taken by surprise, she was going to end up sorting papers for a Brown yet. Of course, the apple-cheeked Domani woman was not Aes Sedai. Back in the tower, Theodrin would have been raised to the shawl already, but here she'd been raised to something more than accepted, less than a full sister. She wore her great serpent ring on her right hand, not her left, and a green dress that went well with her bronze coloring, but she could not choose an Aja or wear the shawl. "I have better things to be about than teaching a bunch of thick-headed novices." Theodrin only smiled at the tartness in Nynaeve's voice. She was quite nice, really. A thick-headed accepted to teach thick-headed novices? Usually she was nice. "Well, once we have you where you can channel without being ready to thump their heads, you will be teaching novices too. And I would not be surprised if you were raised soon after the things you've been discovering. You know, you have never told me what your trick was." Wilders almost always had some trick they had learned, the first unveiling of the ability to channel. The other thing most Wilders had in common was a block, something they had built up in their minds to hide their channeling even from themselves. Nynaeve kept her face smooth with an effort. To be able to channel whenever she wanted. To be raised Aes Sedai. Neither would remedy the problem of Moghedian, but she would be able to go where she wanted then, study as she wanted without anyone telling her this or that simply could not be healed. People got well when they shouldn't. I would get so mad that somebody was going to die that everything I knew about herbs wasn't enough. She shrugged. And they got well. Much better than mine. The slender woman sighed. I could make a boy want to kiss me, or not want to. My block was men, not anger. Nynaeve looked at her incredulously, and Theodrin laughed. Well, it was emotion, too. If there was a man present and I liked or disliked him a great deal, I could channel. If I felt neither one way nor the other, or there wasn't a man at all, I might as well have been a tree so far as Saidar was concerned. How did you ever break through that? Nynaeve asked curiously. Elaine had the novices all paired off now, fumbling their way through passing small flames back and forth. Theodrin's smile deepened, but a blush stained her cheeks too. A young man named Charles, a groom in the tower stables, began making eyes at me. I was 15, and he had the most gorgeous smile. The Aes Sedai let him sit in on my lessons, quietly in a corner, so I could channel it all. What I didn't know was that Shiriam had arranged for him to meet me in the first place. Her cheeks darkened more. I also didn't know he had a twin sister, or that after a few days, that Cheryl sitting in the corner was really Meryl. When she took off her coat and shirt one day in the middle of my lesson, I was so shocked I fainted. But after that, I could channel whenever I wanted. Nynaeve burst out laughing. She could not help it, and despite her blushes, Theodrin joined in without restraint. I wish it could be that easy for me, Theodrin. Whether it is or not, Theodrin said, her laughter fading, we will break down your block. This afternoon, I'm studying Swan this afternoon, Nynaeve cut in hastily, and Theodrin's mouth tightened. You have been avoiding me, Nynaeve. In the past month, you've managed to wriggle out of all but 3 appointments. I can accept your trying and failing, but I will not accept you being afraid to try. I am not, Nynaeve began indignantly, as a small voice asked whether she was trying to hide the truth from herself. It was so disheartening to try and try and try and fail. Theodrin let her have no more than those few words. Allowing that you have commitments today, she said calmly, I will see you tomorrow and every day thereafter, or I will be forced to take other steps. I don't want to do that, and you do not want me to, but I mean to break your block down. Mirella has asked me to make special efforts, and I vow that I will. The near echo of what she had told Swan made Nynaeve's jaw drop. This was the first time the other woman had used the increased authority of her position. It would be just the way Nynaeve's luck was running today for her and Swan to end up waiting to see Tiana side by side. Theodrin did not wait for a reply. She merely nodded as if she had received agreement, then glided off up the street. Nynaeve could almost see a fringed shawl around her shoulders. This morning was not going well at all. And Mirella again. She wanted to scream. Over among the novices, Elaine gave her a proud smile, but Nynaeve only shook her head and turned away. She was going back to her room. It was a measure of how the day was progressing that before she was halfway there, Dagdara Finchi crashed into her running and knocked her flat on her back. Running! An Aes Sedai! The big woman did not stop either, or as much as shout an apology over her shoulder as she plowed through the crowd. Nynaeve picked herself up, dusted herself off, stumped the rest of the way to her room, and slammed the door behind her. It was hot and close. The beds were unmade until Moghedien could get around to them, and worst of all, Nynaeve's weather sense told her there should have been a hailstorm breaking over Salidar right that minute. But she would not be surprised there, or trampled. Flinging herself down atop her rumpled sheets, she lay fingering the silver bracelet, thoughts skittering from what she might manage to dig out of Moghedien today to whether Swan would appear that afternoon, from land to her block to whether she was going to stay in Salidar. It would not be running away, really. She would probably go to Camelin, to Rand. He did need somebody to keep his head from swelling too big, and Elaine would like that. She just wished leaving, not running away, had not begun to seem even more attractive after Theodrin announced her intentions. She expected to have some sign in the emotions oozing through the Idam that Moghedien was finished with her work, and to have to go find her. She often hid when she was sulking. But the shame and outrage never decreased, and the door banging open came as a complete surprise. "So there you are," Moghedien grated. "Look!"
Right, keep his
She
head
held
from
up her
swelling.
hands.
So you don't get too
"Ruined!"
big-headed.
To Nynaeve, they looked no different from any hands that had been doing laundry, white and wrinkled, true, but that would fade. "It is not enough that I must live in squalor, fetching and carrying like a servant. Now I'm expected to labor like some primitive—" Nynaeve cut her off by a simple expedient. She thought of one quick stroke of a switch, what it felt like, then shifted the thought into the part of her mind that held Moghedien's received emotions. The other woman's dark eyes widened, and her mouth clamped shut, lips compressing. Not a hard blow, but a reminder. "Close the door and sit down," Nynaeve said. "You can make the beds later. We are going to have a lesson." "I am used to better than this," Moghedien grumbled as she complied. "A night laborer in Tojar was used to better." "Unless I miss my guess," Nynaeve told her sharply. "A night laborer in wherever didn't have a death sentence hanging over his head. Anytime you want it, we can tell Shiriam exactly who you are." It was pure bluff. Nynaeve's stomach clenched up in a burning ball at the mere thought, but a sickening flood of fear roared out of Moghedien. Nynaeve almost admired how steady the woman's face remained. Had she felt like that, she would have been shrieking and gnashing her teeth on the floor. "What do you want me to show you?" Moghedien said in a level tone. They always had to tell her what they wanted out of her. She practically never volunteered anything unless they pressed her to a point Nynaeve considered the brink of torture. "We'll try something you haven't been very successful with teaching. Detecting a man's channeling." So far, that was the only thing she and Elaine had not been able to pick up quickly. It could be useful if she did decide to go to Camelin. "Not easy, especially with no man to practice on. A pity you haven't been able to heal Logain." There was no mockery in Moghedien's voice or on her face, but she glanced at Nynaeve and hurried on. "Still, we can try the forms again." The lesson truly was not easy. It never was, even with something Nynaeve could learn right away once the weaves became clear. Moghedien could not channel without Nynaeve allowing her to, without Nynaeve guiding her, in fact. But in a new lesson, Moghedien had to give the lead for how the flows were to go. It made a pretty tangle, the main reason they were not able to learn a dozen new things from her every day. In this case, Nynaeve already had some idea of how the flows were woven, but it was an intricate lacework of all of the 5 powers that made healing seem simple, and the pattern shifted at blinding speed. Its difficulty was the weaving
He
that had
is
never
at
been
times.
used very often, Mogedion claimed. It also gave you a grinding headache if kept up very long. Nynaeve lay back on her bed and worked at it as hard as she could, though. If she did go to Rand, she might need this, and there was no telling how soon. She channeled the flows all by herself, too. An occasional thought of Lan or Theodrin kept her anger twisted up tight enough. Sooner or later, Mogedion was going to be called to account for her crimes, and where would Nynaeve be then, used to drawing on the other woman's power whenever she wanted? She had to live and work with her own limits. Could Theodrin find a way to break her block? Lan had to be alive so she could find him. The ache became a pain that bored at her temples. A tightness appeared around Mogedion's eyes, and she rubbed at her head sometimes, but underneath the fear, the bracelet carried a current of what almost seemed contentment. Nynaeve supposed that even when you did not want to teach, it must bring a certain satisfaction. She was not sure she liked Mogedion displaying such a normal human response. She was not sure how long the lesson went on, with Mogedion murmuring, almost, and not quite, but when the door banged open again, she nearly lifted straight up off the mattress. The sudden bolt of fear from Mogedion would have accompanied howling in another woman. "Have you heard, Nynaeve?" Elaine asked, pushing the door to. "There's an emissary from the tower, from Elida." Nynaeve forgot the words she would have shouted if her heart had not been clogging her throat. She even forgot her headache. "An emissary? You're sure?" "Of course I'm sure, Nynaeve. Do you think I'd come running for gossip? The whole village is aflutter." "I don't know why," Nynaeve said sourly. The grating inside her skull was back, and all the goose mint in her scrip of herbs under the bed would not have quieted the burning in her stomach. Would the girl never learn to knock? Mogedion had both hands pressed to her belly as though she could use some goose mint as well. "We did tell them Elida knew about Salidar." "Maybe they believed us," Elaine said, dropping onto the foot of Nynaeve's bed. "And maybe they didn't, but this drove it home. Elida knows where we are, and likely what we are up to. Any of the servants could be her eyes and ears, maybe even some of the sisters. I caught a glimpse of the emissary, Nynaeve. Pale yellow hair and blue eyes that could freeze the sun. A red named Tarna Fear, Phaelane said. One of the warders who was keeping guard escorted her in. When she looks at you, she could be looking at a stone." Nynaeve looked at Mogedion. "We're done with the lesson for now. Come back in an hour and you can make the beds." She waited until Mogedion had gone, tight-lipped and gripping her skirts in fists, then turned to Elaine. "What message did she bring?" "They certainly didn't tell me, Nynaeve. Every Aes Sedai I passed was wondering the same thing. I heard when Tarna was told she'd be received by the Hall of Towers, she laughed, and not as if she was amused. You do not think—" Elaine chewed at her underlip for a moment. "You don't think they could really decide to go back?" Nynaeve said incredulously. "Elida will want them to come the last 10 miles on their knees and the final mile on their bellies. Even if she didn't, even if this red says, 'Come home, all is forgiven and dinner's waiting,' do you think they could brush aside Logain so easily?" "Nynaeve, Aes Sedai could brush aside anything to make the White Tower whole again. Anything. You don't understand them the way I do. There were Aes Sedai in the palace from the day I was born. The question now is, what is Tarna saying to the Hall, and what are they saying to her?" Nynaeve rubbed her arms irritably. She had no answers, only hopes, and her weather sense told her that that hailstorm that was not there was beating the roofs of Salidar like drums. The feeling went on for days.
Chapter 9. Plans. "You had these illuminators brought to Amador?" Many would have flinched to hear such a cold tone from Pedro Nile. but not the man standing on the inlaid golden sunburst before Niall's plain high-backed chair. He exuded confidence and competence. Niall continued. There is a reason I have 2,000 of the children guarding the border with Taraban, Omerna. Taraban is quarantined. No one is allowed across the border. Not a sparrow would cross if I had my way. Myrna was the picture of what an officer of the Children of the Light was supposed to be. Tall and commanding, with a bold, fearless face, a strong chin, and waves of white at his temples. His dark eyes seemed more than capable of surveying the harshest battlefield undismayed, as indeed they had. At the moment, they seemed to indicate deeply considered thought. The white and gold tabard of a Lord Captain, anointed of the light, suited him. My Lord Captain Commander, they wish to establish a chapter house here. Even his voice, deep and mellifluous, fit the image. Illuminators travel everywhere. It should be possible to slip agents among them easily. Agents welcomed into every town, every noble's manor, every ruler's palace. Supposedly, Abdel Omerna was a relatively minor member of the Council of Anointed. In truth, he was the Children of the Light's spy master, after a manner of speaking. Think of it. What Niall thought was that the Guild of Illuminators was Tarabaner to the last man and woman, and Taraban was infected with chaos and madness that he would not let loose in Amadisia. If cauterizing that infection had to wait, he could at least isolate it. They will be treated like anyone else who slips through Omerna. Kept under guard, allowed to talk to no one, and escorted out of Amadisia without delay. If I may insist, my Lord Captain Commander, their usefulness is worth the little gossip they might spread. They keep to themselves, and aside from their use for my agents, the prestige of having an Illuminator's chapter house in Amador would be considerable. The only chapter house now, the one in Kyrian, has been abandoned, and the one in Tonchico surely has been too. Prestige. Niall rubbed his left eye to soothe an involuntary flutter. Little point in getting angry with Omerna, but restraint took an effort. The morning heat cooked his temper over a slow fire. They do indeed keep to themselves, Omerna. They live with their own, travel with their own, and barely speak to anyone else. Do you mean to have these agents marry Illuminators? They rarely marry outside their guild, and there is no way to become an Illuminator except by birth. Well, I am sure a way can be found. Nothing could dent that facade of confidence and competence. It shall be done as I say, Omerna. The man actually opened his mouth again, but Niall forestalled him irritably. As I say, Omerna. I'll hear no more on it. Now, what information do you have today? What useful information? That is your function, not providing fireworks for Iron. Omerna hesitated, plainly wanting to make another plea for his precious Illuminators, but in the end he said pretentiously, The reports of dragon sworn in Altara are more than rumor, it seems, and perhaps in Murandi as well. The infestation is small, but it will grow. A strong move now could settle for them and the Aes Sedai in Saladar in one. Do you dictate strategy for the children now? Gather information and leave its use to me. What else do you have for me? The man's response to being cut off was a calm bow of acquiescence. Omerna was very good at remaining calm. It was perhaps what he did best. I have good news. Baton Stepaneos is ready to join you. He hesitates to make a public announcement, but my people in Ilion report that he soon will. He is reported eager. That would be remarkably good, Niall said dryly. Remarkable, certainly. Among the banners and pennants lining the cornices of the chamber, Baton Stepaneos' 3 leopards, silver on black, hung next to a gold-fringed Ilianer royal standard, 9 bees worked in thread of gold on green silk. The Ilianar king came out on top in the troubles, finally, at least to the point of forcing a treaty that affirmed the border between Amadisia and Altara, where it was at the beginning. But Niall doubted the man would ever forget that he had had the advantage of terrain and numbers at Soramain, and still been defeated and captured. If the Ilianar companions had not covered the field for the rest of the army to escape Niall's trap, Altara would be a fief of the children today, and very likely Murundi and even Ilion. Worse, Matin Stepaneos had a Tarvalan witch for an advisor, though he hid the fact and her. Niall sent emissaries because he dared not leave a path untried. But yes, Matin Stepaneos joining him willingly would be remarkable indeed. Continue, and be brief. I have a busy day today, and I can read your written reports later. Despite those instructions, Omerna's rendition was long, delivered in a sonorous voice full of certainty. Althor had barely extended his control in Andor beyond Cainlan. His lightning onslaught was clearly stalled at last, as Omerna carefully pointed out that he had predicted. There was little chance the Borderlands would join the children against the false dragon anytime soon. Lords in Shinar, Arafel, and Kandor were taking advantage of the Blight's quiet to rebel, and the Queen of Saldaea had gone into seclusion in the country in fear of the same, according to Omerna. His agents were at work, however, and the Borderlands rulers would be brought to heel as soon as these small rebellions were quashed. On the other hand, the rulers of Murundi, Altara, and Giladon were ready to fall into line, though making ambivalent noises at present to soothe the Tarvalan witches. Aleandra of Giladon knew her throne was shaky, knew she needed the children to avoid plummeting as abruptly as her predecessors, while both Tylan of Altara and Rodran of Murundi hoped that the children's weight would make them more than figureheads at last. Plainly, the man considered those lands already as good as in Niall's coat pocket. Within Amadisia, the picture was even better by Omerna's reckoning. Recruits flocked to the children's banners in greater numbers than for years. Strictly speaking, this was none of Omerna's concern, but he always larded his reports with any good news he could find. The prophet would not trouble the land much longer. At present, his rabble squabbled over looting villages and manors in the north, and might well scatter back into Giladon at the next push by Ileron soldiers. Little room remained in the jails because dark friends and Tarvalan spies were being arrested faster than they could be hanged. The search for Tarvalan witches had found only 2 so far, but over 100 women had been put to the question, an indication of how vigilant the patrols were. And fewer refugees from Taraban were being apprehended, proof the quarantine was becoming more effective. Those caught were being thrown back into Taraban as fast as they could be taken back to the border. He hurried past that last, unsurprising given his stupidity with the Illuminators. Niall listened just enough to know where to nod. Omerna had been an adequate commander in the field, so long as someone told him what to do, but in his present position, his credulous stupidity was trying. He had reported Morgase dead, her corpse seen and identified beyond doubt, up to the very day Niall brought him face to face with her. He had ridiculed rumors that the Stone of Tyr had fallen, and still denied that the mightiest fortress in the world could have been taken by any outside force. There had been treason, he insisted, a High Lord who had betrayed the stone to Althor and Tarvalan. He maintained that the disaster at Falma and the troubles in Taraban and Aradaman were the work of Arthur Hawkwing's armies come back across the Arath Ocean. He was convinced that Swan Sanche had not been deposed at all, that Althor was insane and dying, that Tarvalan had murdered King Goldrian to deliberately set off the civil war in Cairhien, and that these 3 facts were somehow tied into those ridiculous rumors, always from somewhere conveniently far away, of people bursting into flame or nightmares leaping out of thin air and slaughtering whole villages. He was not sure how exactly, but he was working on a grand theory he promised to deliver any day. A theory that supposedly would unravel all the witches' schemes and deliver Tarvalan into Niall's hands. That was the way with Omerna. He either invented convoluted reasons for what happened, or else seized on gossip in the streets and swallowed it whole. He spent a good deal of his time listening to gossip, in manor houses and in the streets. Not only had he been seen drinking in the taverns with hunters for the horn, it was an ill-kept secret that he had laid out huge sums for no fewer than 3 supposed horns of a leer. Each time he had carried the thing off to the country and puffed on it for days, till even he had to admit that no dead heroes out of legend were going to come riding back from the grave. Even so, the failures were unlikely to stop him from future purchases in dark alleys or the back rooms of taverns. The simple form of it was this: where a spy master should doubt his own face in the mirror, Omyrna believed anything. Eventually, the man ran down, and Niall said, "I will give your reports due consideration, Omyrna. You have done well." How the fellow preened, smoothing his tabard. "Leave me now. On your way out, send Bulwer in. I have some letters to dictate." "Of course, my Lord Captain Commander." "Ah." In the middle of his bow, Omyrna frowned and fumbled in the pocket of his white undercoat, pulling out a tiny bone cylinder that he handed to Niall. "This arrived at the Pigeon Cote this morning." 3 thin red stripes ran the length of the cylinder, meaning it was to be brought to Niall with the wax seals intact. And the man had almost forgotten it. Omyrna waited, no doubt hoping for a hint of what the cylinder contained, but Niall waved him toward the door. "Do not forget Bulwer. If Matin Stepaneos might join me, I must write and see if I can add a little weight to his making the right decision." Omyrna had no choice but to make his bow anew and go.
Right.
Even when the door closed behind the man, Niall only fingered the cylinder. These rare special messages seldom brought good news. Rising slowly, of late he sometimes felt age in his bones, he filled a plain silver goblet with punch, but then left it sitting on the table and flipped open a folder of scroll-worked leather lined with linen. It contained a single sheet of heavy paper, crumpled and partly torn. A street artist's drawing in colored chalks of 2 men fighting in clouds, one with a face made of fire, the other with dark reddish hair. Althor. All his plans to hinder the false dragon had gone awry, all his hopes to slow the man's tide of conquest, to divert him. Had he waited too long, let Althor grow too powerful? If so, there was only one way to deal with him quickly: the knife in the dark, the arrow from a rooftop. How long did he dare wait? Did he dare risk not waiting? Too much haste could spell disaster as surely as too long a delay.
Not good for long
"My lord sent for me." Niall eyed the man who
old
entered so
game chair that I
silently.
got from my neighbor.
On the face of it, it hardly seemed
As I
possible
clearly
that Bulwer
know,
could move without a dry rustle announcing his presence.
cushion on the seat.
Everything about him was
I
narrow and
have a damn,
hinged.
like,
His brown coat hung from knobby shoulders, and his legs looked
real
as if they
damn
might
little
snap
memory
under his
foam
desiccated weight.
thing on it,
He
but
moved like a bird hopping
they
from
don't
limb
help
to
for
limb.
very long.
"Do you believe the Horn of Valia will call dead heroes back to us, Bulwer?" "Perhaps, my lord," Bulwer said, folding his hands fussily. "Perhaps not. I would not count on it myself." Niall nodded. "And do you think Matin Stepaneos will join me?" "Again, perhaps. He will not want to finish dead or a puppet. His first and only concern is to hold on to the laurel crown, and the army gathering in Tyr must make him sweat for that." Bulwer smiled thinly, a bare compression of lips. "He has spoken openly about accepting my lord's proposal, but on the other hand, I've just learned he has been communicating with the White Tower. Apparently he has agreed to something, though I don't yet know what." The world knew that Abdel Omyrna was the children's spy master. Such a position should have been secret, of course, but stable boys and beggars pointed him out in the street, warily, lest the most dangerous men in Amadisia see them. The truth was that Omyrna was a decoy, a fool who did not know himself that he was only a mask hiding the true master of spies in the Fortress of the Light. Seban Bulwer, Niall's prim, dried-up little secretary with his disapproving mouth. A man no one would ever suspect or credit if he was named to them. Where O'Myrna believed everything, Bulwer believed nothing, perhaps
I'll
not
be
even
right
in
back.
Dark Friends or the Dark One. If Bulwer did believe in anything, it was looking over men's shoulders, listening to their whispers, rooting out their secrets. Of course, he would have served any master as well as he did Niall, but that was all to the good. What Bulwer learned was never tainted by what he knew had to be true or wanted to be true. Disbelieving everything, he always managed to root out truth. No more than I expected out of William Bulwer, but even he can be brought round. He would have to be. It could not be too late. Is there any fresh word from the borderlands? Not yet, my lord. But Davram Bashir is in Camelot, with 30,000 light horse, my informants claim. But I think no more than half that. He would not weaken Saldea too far, however quiet the blight, even if Tenobia commanded him to. Niall grunted, the corner of his left eye trembling. He fingered the sketch lying in its folder. Supposedly it was a fair likeness of Althor. Bashir and Camelin, a good reason for Tenobia to be hiding in the country from his envoy. There was no good news from the borderlands, whatever O'Myrna thought. The minor rebellions O'Myrna reported were minor, but not rebellions of the sort the man thought. Along the Blight border, men were arguing over whether Althor was another false dragon or the dragon reborn. Borderlanders being as they were, sometimes these arguments led into small-scale battles. The fighting had begun in Shinar about the time the Stone of Tyr was falling, confirmation of the witch's involvement, if any was needed. How it would all be settled was yet in doubt, according to Bulwer. That Althor remained confined to Camelin was one of the few things O'Myrna had right. Yet why, with Bashir and Aiel and the witches? Not even Bulwer had been able to answer that. Whatever the reason, the light be praised for it. The prophet's mobs had settled in to loot the north of Amadesia, true, but they were consolidating their hold, killing or putting to flight any who refused to declare for the prophet of the dragon. Alron's soldiers had only stopped retreating because the accursed prophet had stopped advancing. Aleandra and the others O'Myrna was certain would join him were in fact dithering, putting off his ambassadors with flimsy excuses and delays. He suspected that they knew no more how they would leap than he did. On the surface, everything seemed to be going Althor's way at the moment, except for whatever held him in Camelin. But Niall had always been at his most dangerous when he was outnumbered and with his back to the wall. If the rumors were believed, Saradin was doing well, and Mirundi, though not as quickly as Niall would like. Time was as much an enemy as Althor or the Tower. Yet even if Karadin was only doing well in the rumors, that should be enough. Perhaps it was time to extend the Dragon Sworn into Andor. Perhaps Ilion as well, though if the army gathering in Tyr was not enough to show Mat and Stepaneus the path, a few farms and villages raided would hardly make a difference. The size of that army horrified Niall. If it was half what Bulwer reported, a quarter, it still horrified him. Nothing like it had been seen since Arthur Hawkwing's day. Rather than frighten men into joining Niall, an army like that might intimidate them into falling in behind the dragon banner. Could he have found a year, just half a year, he would have accounted it worth Althor's whole army of fools and villains and Aiel savages. All was not lost, of course. All was never lost as long as you were alive. Daraban and Aradoman were as useless to Althor and the witches as to him, 2 pits full of scorpions. Only a fool would put a hand in there until more of the scorpions killed one another off. If Saldea was lost, which he would not concede, Shinar and Darafel and Kandor still hung in the balance, and balances could be tipped. If Mat and Stepaneos wanted to ride 2 horses at once, he'd always like to try that. He could yet be forced to choose the right one. Altara and Murundi would be prodded to the proper side, and Andor would drop into his hand whether or not he decided a touch of Carradin's whip was required. In Tyr, Bulwer's agents had convinced Tadosian and Istanda to join Darlin, turning a show of defiance into real rebellion. The man was confident the same could be done in Cairhien and in Andor. Another month, 2 at the outside, and Eamon Valda would arrive from Tarvalon. Niall could have done without Valda, but then the great majority of the children's strength would be in one spot, ready to use where it could do the most good. Yes, he had a good deal on his side yet. Nothing had solidified, but everything coalesced. Time was all that was needed. Realizing he still held the bone cylinder, he cracked the wax seal with a thumbnail and carefully drew out the thin paper rolled up inside. Bulwer said nothing, but his mouth compressed again, not in a smile this time. Omerna he put up with, knowing the man a fool, much preferring to remain hidden himself, but he did not like Niall receiving reports that bypassed him from men he did not know. A tiny, spidery scrawl covered the slip in a cipher that few besides Niall knew, none of them in Amador. For him, reading it was as easy as reading his own hand. The sign at the bottom made him blink, and so did the contents. Varadin was, or had been, one of the best of his personal agents, a rug seller who did good service during the Troubles while peddling his wares through Altara, Murundi, and Ilion. What he earned there had set him up as a wealthy merchant in Tanchico, regularly supplying fine carpets and wines to the palaces of King and Ponarch, as well as to most of the nobles of their courts, and always leaving with his eyes and ears full. Niall had thought him long since dead in the upheaval there. This was the first word from him in a year. From what Varadin wrote, it would have been better if he truly had been a year dead. In the jerky hand of a man on the brink of madness, a wild, disjointed ramble about men riding strange beasts and flying creatures, Aes Sedai on leashes, and the Hylian. That meant forerunners in the old tongue, but there was not even an attempt to explain why Varadin was terrified of them, or who they were supposed to be. Plainly the man had taken a brain fever from watching his country disintegrate around him. Annoyed, Niall crumpled the paper and threw it aside. First I must sit through Omerna's idiocy, and now this. What else do you have for me, Bulwer? Bashir. Matters could be hefty with Bashir to general authority. The man had earned his reputation. A dagger in the shadows for him? Bulwer's eyes never left Niall's face by so much as a flicker, but Niall knew the tiny ball of paper on the floor would end up in the man's hands unless he burned it. 4 things that might be of interest, my lord. The least first. The rumors about meetings between the Ogier Stedding are true. For Ogier, they seem to be showing some haste. He did not say what the meetings were about, of course. Getting a human into an Ogier stump was as impossible as getting an Ogier to spy. Easier to have the sun rise at night. Also, there are an unusual number of seafolk ships in the southern ports, not taking cargo, not sailing. What are they waiting for? For a moment, Bulwer's mouth tightened as though drawstrings had been pulled shut. I do not know yet, my lord. Bulwer never liked admitting there were any human secrets he could not ferret out. Trying to learn more than the surface of what went on among the Apa on the air was like trying to learn how the Guild of Illuminators made fireworks, an exercise in futility. At least the Ogier might eventually make known the decisions of their meetings. Continue. The news of middling interest is peculiar, my lord. Althor has reliably been reported in Camelin, in Tyr, and in Cairhien, sometimes on the same day. Reliably? Reliable madness? The witches probably have 2 or 3 men who look like Althor. Enough to fool anyone who doesn't know him. That would explain a good deal. Perhaps, my lord. My informants are reliable. Niles slapped the leather folder closed, hiding Althor's face. And the news of greatest interest? I have it from 2 sources in Altara, reliable sources, my lord, that the witches in Saladar claim the Red Archer encouraged Loghain to become a false dragon. All but created him, in fact. They have Loghain in Saladar, or a man they say is Loghain, and are showing him to nobles they bring there. I have no proof, but I suspect they are telling the same tale to any ruler they can reach. Frowning, Niall studied the banners overhead. Those represented enemies from nearly every land. Not one had ever defeated him twice, and few won. The banners were all faded with age now, like him. Yet he was not too fated to see an end to what he had begun. Every banner taken in bloody battle, well, you never really knew what was happening beyond sight of your own eyes, where certain victory and certain defeat could be equally ephemeral. The worst battle he had ever fought, armies blundering into one another in the night near Moisen during the Troubles, had been clear as a bright summer's day compared to the one he fought now. Could he have been wrong? Could the tower really be broken? A struggle of some sort between the Adjas? Over what? Althor? If the witches were fighting among themselves, there would be many in the children ready to advocate Karadin's solution. A strike to destroy Saladar with the witches is possible. Men who believed thinking of tomorrow was thinking ahead, but never considered next week or next month, let alone next year. Valda, for one. Perhaps it was just as well he had not reached Amador yet. For another, Radam Asanawa, the High Inquisitor of the Questioners. Valda always wanted to use an axe, even when a poignard was best for the task at hand. Asanawa just wanted every woman who had ever spent a night in the tower hanged as of yesterday, every book that mentioned Aes Sedai or the One Power burned, and the words themselves banned. Asanawa never had a thought beyond those goals, nor a care for costs. Niall had worked too hard, risked too much, to allow this to become a struggle between the children and the tower in the eyes of the world. In truth, it did not matter whether he was wrong. If he was, it still could be very much to his advantage, perhaps more than if he was right. With a little luck, he could shatter the White Tower past repairing, splinter the witches into shards easily ground to dust. Althor would surely falter then, while remaining enough of a threat to be used as a goad. And he could hold closely to the truth, fairly closely. Without taking his eyes from the banners, he said, "The split in the tower is real. The Black Aja rose up. The victors hold the tower, and the losers were driven out to lick their wounds in Saladar." He looked at Bulwer and nearly smiled. One of the children would have been protesting that there was no Black Aja, or rather, that all the witches were dark friends. The newest recruit would have. Bulwer merely looked at him, not at all as if he had just blasphemed against all the children stood for. The only decision to make is whether the Black Aja won or lost. I think they won. Most people will think of whoever holds the tower as the real Aes Sedai. Let them associate real Aes Sedai with Black Aja. Althor is a creature of the tower, a vassal of the Black Aja. Lifting his wine cup from the table, he took a sip. It did not help the heat. Perhaps I can fit it in with why I haven't moved against Saladar yet. Through his emissaries, he had been using the failure to move as proof of how dire he saw the threat from Althor. He was willing to let the witches congregate on Amadisia's doorstep rather than be diverted from the danger of the false dragon. The women there, appalled after all these years at how pervasive the Black Aja is, repelled at last by the evil they've been immersed in. If darkness ran out, they were all servants of the Dark One. What evil could repel them? But after a moment, Bulwer took it up. Perhaps they've decided to throw themselves on my lord's mercy, even ask my lord's protection. Losers in a rebellion, weaker than their enemies, fearing to be crushed. A man falling off a cliff to certain death will stretch out a hand even to his worst enemy. Perhaps... Bulwer tapped bony fingers against his lips in thought. Perhaps they are ready to repent their sins and renounce being Aes Sedai? Niall stared at him. He suspected the Tavalan witch's sins were among the things Bulwer did not believe in. That is absurd, he said flatly. It's the sort of thing I might expect from Omerna. His secretary's face remained as prim as ever, but he began dry-washing his hands the way he did when he felt insulted. What my lord might expect to hear from him, but just the sort of thing that will be repeated where he does most of his listening, in the streets and where nobles gossip over wine. Absurdities are never laughed at there, only listened to. What is too absurd to believe is believed because it is too absurd to be a lie. How would you present it? I will start no rumor of the children dealing with the witches. It would only be a rumor. His gaze hardened and Bulwer spread his hands. As my lord wishes. Each retelling always adds embellishment, so a simple tale has the best chance of the core surviving. I suggest 4 rumors, my lord, not 1. The first, that the division in the tower was caused by a Black Abja uprising. The second, that the Black Abja won and control the tower. Third, the Aes Sedai and Saladar, repelled and horrified, are renouncing being Aes Sedai. And fourth, they have approached you, seeking mercy and protection. For most people, it would be confirmation of the others. Tugging at his Bulwer gave a narrow self. Very good, Bulwer. Let it be so. Niall took a deeper drink of wine. The heat was making him feel his age.
All right, everyone. Good. Call into this life tonight. I want to thank everyone for stopping by and everyone who continues to stop by. I appreciate all y'all's support. Till next time, everyone. Y'all stay safe and have a good night.